Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where old mysteries are given a quieter light, and the ancient world gets a little room to breathe before bed. Tonight, we're settling in with one of the strangest figures in Mesopotamian myth, a being with wings, claws, storm power, and a habit of causing the kind of divine trouble that makes the gods sit up very quickly. This is the story of Anzu, the storm bird of the Anunnaki. And if ever there were a creature designed to make ancient people look up at the sky and feel just a little uneasy, this would be a strong candidate. Before we begin properly, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. There's something fitting about that with a story like this. Somewhere, it may be deep night. Somewhere else, early morning. Somewhere, rain might be tapping at a window. Somewhere else, the sky may be perfectly still. And if you find this calm, interesting, or simply a nice place to rest your mind for a while, do consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps this little corner of quiet history reach other people who might also enjoy drifting off with old gods, ancient storms, and the occasional very badly behaved mythic bird. Now, get comfortable, settle your thoughts a little, and let's ease into it. When people think of Mesopotamian mythology, they often think first of kings, ziggurats, flood stories, strange divine councils, and the famous names that return again and again from clay tablets baked in the heat of long-vanished cities. They think of Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Marduk, Gilgamesh, maybe even the underworld and its gates. Fair enough. Mesopotamia earned that reputation. It was one of the great early homes of urban civilization, a place where writing took shape, temple life grew powerful, and human beings began recording not only taxes and grain deliveries, but also fear, ambition, devotion, memory, and myth. But tucked inside that world are creatures that feel just as important as the gods themselves, because they reveal what ancient people thought power looked like when it stopped being human. And Anzu is one of those beings. Anzu is not a gentle symbol. He's not a decorative bird drifting across the edges of a story. He's not the sort of creature added just to make a myth sound colourful. He belongs to a deeper kind of ancient imagination, the kind that looked at storms, mountains and violent weather, and decided that somewhere inside all that force there had to be a will. Not just noise, not just air, not just rain, a presence. That matters, because for the people of ancient Mesopotamia, nature was rarely just scenery. The sky was not a painted ceiling. The wind was not just weather. Thunder did not feel like an interesting atmospheric event with a helpful forecast scheduled for 6 p.m. It felt alive. It felt charged. It felt like something outside human control, and therefore very close to the divine. When lightning crossed the sky, or heavy storm clouds rolled over the land, people did not have satellite maps, pressure charts, or a weather presenter in a bright jacket pointing cheerfully at incoming danger. They had observation, memory, ritual, and fear. They knew what storms could do. Storms flattened crops, flooded ground, destroyed mud brick structures, and reminded human beings very efficiently that all their plans depended on forces larger than themselves. So when a culture gives shape to storm power as a great bird, that is not random. It is a way of making sense of force. Wings suggest the sky. Talons suggest violence. A beak suggests tearing. Height suggests rule. Birds of prey already move through the world like small kings, and if you enlarge one into something mythic, then attach to it the roar of thunder and the authority of divine conflict, you get a being like Anzu. The name itself appears across Mesopotamian tradition in forms that scholars connect with the Sumerian Imdugud and the Akkadian Anzu. Already that tells you something important. This was not a figure that belonged to one isolated tale told once and forgotten. He travelled through language, through cultures, through the long handoff from Sumerian tradition into Akkadian and beyond. That is usually a sign that a mythic figure mattered. People preserved him because he did something memorable, or represented something difficult to let go of, or both. Visually, Anzu is often understood as a monstrous bird associated with storm and mountain power, sometimes described or depicted with features that combine eagle and lion, which is really just ancient art saying why settle for one terrifying animal when you could combine two? The eagle already rules the air. The lion already rules by strength and dominance. Put them together, and you no longer have an ordinary creature. You have concentrated authority with feathers, and yet even that description, useful as it is, does not fully explain why Anzu lingers in the mind. Lots of mythologies have beasts. Many cultures invent monsters. Some guard treasure. Some devour the unwary. Some exist mainly so a hero has something impressive to stab. Anzu is more interesting than that, because he is wrapped into questions of divine order. His story is not simply about danger in the wild. It is about who has the right to rule, who can command the structure of the world, who gets to hold cosmic authority, and what happens when that authority is taken. That is where Anzu becomes more than a bird. In one of the best-known strands of his myth, Anzu steals the Tablet of Destinies, a sacred object of enormous power, linked with divine legitimacy and control. That detail lifts the whole story out of the category of monster causes trouble and into something much more serious. This is not a beast raiding a village. This is a being reaching into the machinery of the cosmos and taking something that was not supposed to leave its proper hands. If that sounds dramatic, it is because Mesopotamian myth is often very good at that. It knows how to take a symbolic idea and give it a shape that can move. Authority is not just a concept, it is a tablet. Order is not just a theory. It is held, guarded, lost, and recovered. The universe is not just there, it must be maintained. That ancient way of thinking deserves a little patience, because it is easy from a modern point of view to hear Tablet of Destinies and imagine a fantasy prop in a film, perhaps glowing a bit too much while somebody in elaborate armour explains the plot. But for Mesopotamian religion and kingship, the connection between power and rightful decree was real and serious. To issue decrees, to establish fates, to set the order of things, these were acts of rule. They were what made a high god high. So when Anzu steals such a thing, the crime is not only theft, it is rebellion, usurpation, a strike against the chain of command that keeps heaven and earth functioning as they should. And this, quietly, is one of the reasons Anzu becomes such an appealing figure in ancient narrative. He is frightening, yes, but he's also transgressive. He crosses a line. He reaches above his place. He becomes the embodiment of a terrifying question that many mythologies like to ask in one form or another. What if the wrong being got hold of the right power? You can see why that would trouble the gods. You can also see why it would fascinate human listeners. Because ancient myths are rarely only about gods and monsters. They are also about structure, loyalty, ambition, and fear of disorder. A myth about the theft of divine authority is also a myth about political anxiety, temple anxiety, royal anxiety, and very human anxiety. It asks what happens when the seat of power is exposed. It asks what happens when rank can be challenged. It asks whether strength alone should rule, or whether rule depends on something more delicate, more formal, more sanctioned. Mesopotamia cared deeply about those questions. This was a world built from city-states, temple economies, royal claims, inherited traditions, and constant negotiation between earthly power and divine approval. Kings did not merely want to be strong, they wanted to be legitimate. Priests did not merely perform rituals, they maintained bonds between city and God. Order mattered, records mattered, proper offerings mattered, names and ranks mattered. In a world so invested in rightful structure, Anzu's story would have landed with unusual force. He is not just wildness. He is wildness making a bid for the throne. And the thing about that kind of myth is that it never becomes entirely old. Even now, there is something instantly understandable about the image. a powerful outsider perched at the edges of the ordered world seizes what should not be seized, and suddenly the entire system trembles. That is a story pattern human beings recognize almost too easily. Change a few costumes, swap a tablet for a crown, a throne, a code, a weapon, a secret, or a set of keys, and the structure still works. There is a reason such stories keep returning. They press directly on the fear that systems are only stable until something stronger, quicker, or bolder breaks in. But long before we get to theft, panic, and battle, it helps to understand the atmosphere Anzu belongs to. Mesopotamia was not a mountain civilization in the way some other ancient cultures were. Its great cities rose in river plains, in the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates. That river-fed landscape gave life, wealth, agriculture, and the possibility of urban scale. Yet beyond those plains were rougher regions, especially the eastern mountains, places that could feel distant, dangerous, and charged with otherness. Mountains in Mesopotamian imagination often carried a particular weight. They could be sources of timber, stone, threat, foreign peoples, and mythic distance. They were not the daily setting of most southern city life. They belonged, in a sense, to the edge. That edge matters for Anzu. A storm bird associated with mountain spaces feels right in a Mesopotamian mental map. High places catch weather. High places obscure sight. High places are harder to control. They stand apart from the orderly geometry of city walls, canals, temples, and fields. If the city is where humans and gods negotiate order, the mountain is where order thins out, and that makes it an excellent home for a being like Anzu. He belongs overhead and beyond reach. He belongs where clouds build and visibility fails. He belongs where a human traveller might feel small very quickly. He is one of those mythic creatures whose geography is part of the meaning. Put him in a marketplace, and he becomes strange in one way. Put him in high, storm-dark places, and he becomes inevitable. This is also why Anzu feels older than any single written story about him. Even when we encounter him through tablets, through literary versions preserved by scribes, there is a sense that the image reaches back into something more basic. Human beings everywhere have watched large birds circle above and felt the old instinct that being watched from the sky is a little unsettling. Add a thunderstorm, and the feeling improves only slightly. The eagle, or eagle-like bird, is particularly well suited to myth. It appears suddenly. It strikes downward. It sees what others do not. It lives in inaccessible places. It can vanish into height. Even today, people stop and look when a large bird of prey passes overhead. There is still a moment of recognition, some old part of the brain noting competence, speed and distance from ordinary human limits. Ancient people noticed that too, only with fewer distractions and much more reason to treat the natural world as a field of signs. So Anzu likely drew strength not only from formal theology, but from direct observation transformed by imagination. The bird in the storm over the ridge, the sky creature linked to power. These are not difficult symbolic leaps to make. What is difficult and more interesting is what Mesopotamian tradition chose to do with that creature once it had taken shape. It could have left him as a symbol of raw weather. It could have kept him as a guardian figure. In some context, related imagery certainly does carry protective or heraldic force. Ancient art is full of beings that are not merely decorative, but loaded with meaning, identity, and divine association. Yet Anzu, in the story that made him unforgettable, becomes a rebel against divine order. That tells us something revealing about Mesopotamian storytelling. It did not only fear chaos from below, it feared chaos from above, from within the structure of divine power itself. A creature close enough to the gods to know what matters most can become more dangerous than a simple beast, because he understands where the system is vulnerable. That is a very sophisticated anxiety for a myth to carry, and one reason the tale does not feel simplistic. Anzu is not just powerful, he is strategically powerful. He targets authority itself. He understands, or at least acts as if he understands, that to hold the right object is to alter the balance of heaven. And then, naturally comes the problem of response. One of the quiet pleasures of Mesopotamian myths is that the gods are not always immediately decisive. They are mighty, certainly, but they can also be alarmed, hesitant, political, and very aware of risk. That makes them more interesting than the sort of flat divine figures who simply solve everything by existing. In Anzu's story, the theft of cosmic authority does not produce instant calm correction. It produces crisis. The assembly must react. A champion must be found. Somebody has to face the storm bird and undo the damage. That gives the myth motion, but it also gives it texture. We're not in a world where order is automatic. Order requires defense. It requires courage. It may even require a being willing to confront the sky itself. And that is where figures like Ninurta enter later in the story, as warrior power directed back toward restoration. But that comes after the tension has been allowed to spread. A good myth understands suspense. It does not immediately hand back the tablet and tell everyone to relax. Still, even before the famous theft and battle, Anzu already carries enough symbolic weight to matter on his own. He sits at the intersection of several powerful ancient ideas: storm, height, animal ferocity, divine conflict, the fragility of order, and the possibility that what is wild can also be cunning. Not all monsters are intelligent in myth. Some are appetite with legs, some are brute force. Anzu is more dangerous because he enters the zone of motive. He wants, he takes, he disrupts. That kind of being does not just threaten bodies, it threatens structure, and ancient listeners would have felt that differently than we do. In a modern setting, structure can sound dull, like paperwork or a meeting that should have been an email. In Mesopotamia, structure meant survival. It meant irrigation maintained, temples provisioned, calendars observed, grain accounted for, rituals completed, kings confirmed, disasters interpreted. A break in divine order was not abstract. It implied a break in the conditions that allowed civilization to keep functioning. That helps explain why myths of cosmic struggle could feel immediately relevant to ordinary life. A farmer may never meet a god, but he knows what disorder does to crops. A city worker may never see the Tablet of Destinies, but she knows what happens when authority fails, when protection weakens, when systems break down. Myth translates those lived concerns upward into divine drama. It says, the things that trouble your world also trouble the heavens. And once you start reading Anzu that way, he becomes even more compelling. He is not only a bird, he is a stress test for the universe. There is also something worth noticing in the way Mesopotamian myth handles creatures that are neither fully outside the divine world nor comfortably inside it. The ancient Near East is full of beings that blur categories. Guardians, monsters, hybrids, attendants, demons, sacred animals, divine symbols. The boundary between god, creature, emblem and force is not always clean. That can be confusing at first to a modern reader who wants everything filed in separate drawers with neat labels. Ancient myth is less interested in neat drawers. It prefers charged overlap. Anzu belongs in that overlap. He is bird, storm, adversary and power image all at once. That complexity is part of what keeps him from becoming flat. He can feel like an enemy, but also like a necessary expression of the very world the gods rule. After all, if the divine realm includes storm power, why should storm power always behave politely? That may be another reason the tale works. Anzu is not imported from nowhere. He feels native to the same cosmos he endangers. He's of that world, even while threatening its order, and that makes the conflict sharper. The danger is not merely outside invasion, it is internal instability. That is a theme ancient societies understood very well. It is also one of the reasons stories like this survive. They continue to feel relevant because they are built on durable tensions, power and legitimacy, strength and right, wild force and lawful rule, the outsider and the centre, the storm at the edge of the map and the city trying to keep its walls meaningful. So as we move deeper into Anzu's story, it helps to keep all of that in mind. We are not just meeting a monster from an old tale. We are entering a worldview in which the sky is active, authority is sacred, and a bird can become the centre of a cosmic emergency. That is a wonderfully Mesopotamian kind of problem, and perhaps the most striking thing is that the story does not begin from smallness. It begins from scale. The stakes are high from the start because Anzu belongs to the level where divine rule and universal order meet. By the time he acts, the consequences will reach far beyond himself, which is why the old scribes, patiently pressing signs into clay, preserved him as more than a curious beast. They preserved him as a threat worth remembering. Because somewhere in the old imagination of the ancient Near East, above the fields and temples, beyond the ordered life of the cities, there was the idea of a great storm bird waiting in the heights, powerful enough to challenge the structure of heaven itself. And before that challenge could erupt into theft, pursuit, and battle, there first had to be a world in which a being like Anzu could exist at all. A world of gods, ranks, sacred power, and dangerous proximity to it. That is where the story really begins, and to understand the trouble he would cause, we have to look more closely at what Anzu was believed to be. To understand Anzu properly, it helps to slow down before the famous theft, before the panic among the gods, before the warrior is chosen and the arrows start flying, because if we rush straight to the dramatic moment, we miss something important. Ancient Mesopotamian stories rarely treat a creature like Anzu as just a moving piece in the plot. He is not only there to steal something, cause alarm, and then get dealt with. He arrives carrying a whole set of meanings with him. He belongs to the sky, to storm, to distance, to danger, and to that old human instinct that says large things overhead are somehow more serious than large things on the ground. And Anzu really is an overhead kind of creature. When ancient texts describe or imply what he is, they do not present a harmless bird with unusual confidence. They present a being of scale and force, often understood as a gigantic lion-headed eagle or a similarly composite storm bird, depending on the text, the period, and the artistic tradition in question. That combination is already doing a lot of work. The eagle, or eagle-like bird, gives him the sky. The lion gives him raw earthly dominance. Together they make something that sounds less like wildlife and more like a conclusion somebody reached after asking, what would happen if the most dangerous thing above us and the most dangerous thing beside us were somehow the same creature? The answer, apparently, was Anzu. That kind of hybrid was not unusual in the ancient Near East. Mesopotamian visual culture liked composite beings. It liked creatures that combined strengths, human intelligence with animal force, wings with claws, bulls with human heads, lions with eagle features. These were not random fantasy flourishes in the modern sense. They reflected a way of imagining power through accumulation. If one creature is strong and another is swift, put them together and you create something more than either one alone. A hybrid can express concentrated authority. It can suggest that ordinary categories no longer apply. Once a being has crossed those boundaries, it becomes harder to place, and therefore harder to control. That last part matters more than it might seem. Human beings are usually calmer around things they can classify. Bird, lion, storm, mountain. Dangerous perhaps, but understandable. Once those categories blur, anxiety tends to rise. A creature that is both familiar and not familiar often unsettles the mind more than a completely alien one. That is one reason so many ancient monsters feel memorable. They are built from known pieces but refuse to stay in their proper drawer. Anzu is exactly that kind of being. He is close enough to the natural world to feel possible, but strange enough to feel wrong. And wrong, in old myth, often means powerful. The connection between Anzu and storms is essential. Without it, he would still be impressive, but he would not be Anzu. Storm power is what gives him a larger scale than animal strength alone. The storm is one of the most obvious expressions of force in the natural world. It arrives from above. It changes the air before it is seen. It makes sound travel differently. It darkens the horizon. It can nourish life through rain, then destroy that same life through wind, flood, hail, or lightning. It is useful and terrifying at the same time, which already sounds very much like something ancient people would associate with divinity. Mesopotamians were especially sensitive to that kind of force because they lived in an environment where weather and water mattered enormously. Their cities depended on rivers, irrigation, seasonal patterns, and fragile balances that could be upset. Too little water was disaster. Too much water was also disaster. A storm was never just scenery. It could be a blessing, warning, punishment, or threat. It could alter fields, buildings, and expectations in a single violent stretch of time. So when a mythic bird becomes tied to storm energy, he enters the story with more than dramatic flair. He enters as a walking, or rather flying, version of instability. But there is another layer here, and it has to do with mountains. Mesopotamian civilization is often imagined through the broad flatness of the great river plains, and that is fair enough. The southern cities especially rose in low alluvial country, where mud brick architecture, canals, and fertile agriculture defined the human landscape. Yet Mesopotamian imagination was not limited to its own flat ground. The mountains beyond the plains had a strong symbolic charge. They were places of distance, difficulty, foreignness, and resources that the cities themselves lacked. Timber, metals, and stone often came from farther and higher lands. So did enemies, strangers, and whatever else the city could not fully domesticate. To people living in a world where ordered space was built and maintained through walls, temples, canals, administration, and ritual, the mountains stood for a different kind of reality. They were less governed, less measured, less comfortable. A mountain range does not care about boundary stones, tax records, or temple schedules. It simply rises, hard and indifferent, catching weather and hiding whatever lives in its shadows. That makes it exactly the sort of place a creature like Anzu should come from. He's not a courtyard animal. He's not a city bird. He does not belong on a decorative wall eating grain with mild enthusiasm. He belongs in remote heights, in places where clouds gather around ridges and human beings feel very temporary. There is a reason powerful beings so often live on mountains or near them in ancient myth. Height implies proximity to the heavens, but it also implies removal from ordinary life. A mountain creature is not merely strong, it is hard to reach, hard to challenge. It sees farther than people below. It can descend without warning and retreat beyond pursuit. Anzu fits that pattern almost perfectly. Some versions of the tradition connect him especially with mountain regions, and that makes symbolic sense even where the texts are fragmentary or varied. A storm bird in the mountains is force in its proper setting. The mountain gives him theatre, the storm gives him motion, the bird form gives him command of the air, while the hybrid body gives him the violence needed to make him more than a sign in the clouds. Once those ingredients come together, Anzu becomes the sort of being people tell stories about, not because they have seen him clearly, but because the world seems arranged in a way that suggests something like him must be out there. That is an old habit of the human mind, and not a foolish one. People have always built mythology from observation plus pressure. You observe the world, then apply emotional and symbolic pressure until it speaks. A cliff becomes a boundary, a river becomes a god, a storm becomes an anger, a great bird becomes a ruler of the upper air. The process is natural. It does not require a single inventor sitting down one afternoon with a stylus and thinking, "Right then, today, I shall create a lion-headed weather eagle and see whether it catches on." It develops over time through images, associations, fear, ritual, and retelling. Anzu probably drew strength from several layers of meaning at once. There was the visible behaviour of large birds of prey, which already seems severe in a way pigeons never quite manage. There was the sensory force of storms in mountainous terrain. There was the long Near Eastern habit of representing power through hybrid creatures. And there was the theological question of how the gods relate to untamed cosmic force. If the divine realm includes order, rule, decree, kingship, and structured authority, then where do you place the wild power that can challenge those things? One answer is to give it a body with wings and a name. Even his physical image suggests that he is not meant to be merely decorative. A lion-headed eagle is not elegant in the neat, polished sense. It is confrontational. It is built to overmatch. The lion's head gives him jaw, roar, and terrestrial kingship. The eagle's body gives him the sweep of the sky, the arc of the dive, and the threat of sudden descent. Put them together and you get something that appears to rule more than one domain at once, which is exactly why he becomes so dangerous later. A creature that belongs partly to one realm and partly to another can cross boundaries the more specialized beings cannot. That makes Anzu a perfect boundary breaker. He is also, importantly, not just brute strength. Ancient myths often distinguish between creatures that are dangerous because they are huge, and creatures that are dangerous because they understand where to strike. Anzu belongs to the second group. Even when we meet him first as an image or a type, there is already a sense that he is more than weather with claws. He is not a random storm beast flapping about noisily and hoping for the best. He is a being close enough to divine power to recognize its importance. Later, when he acts, he does so with purpose. That purpose is what turns him from impressive monster into existential problem. But before that, people had to imagine what it would mean for such a creature simply to exist. And perhaps the best way to think of that is to picture the old Mesopotamian landscape from the point of view of someone living in one of the great cities. Life is organized. Temples rise. Officials record things. Farmers work fields. Priests observe rituals. Rulers make claims about divine backing. There is order, at least as much order as any ancient city can manage, which is to say enough to be proud of and never quite enough to relax. Beyond that managed world are roads, river traffic, neighbouring cities, hostile powers, and farther off, the more uncertain lands of hills and mountains. Above all of it is the sky, which nobody owns. That last detail matters more than most. The city can wall land, a king can command labour, priests can define sacred space, but the sky remains beyond possession. It is visible to everyone and controlled by no one. It changes without permission. It can bless crops and destroy them. It can remain calm for days, then turn black in an afternoon. Any mythic creature tied to that realm automatically inherits a certain freedom from human systems. The sky is the oldest refusal in the world. You cannot lock it. You cannot negotiate with it. You cannot make it sign an agreement witnessed by temple officials. Anzu carries that refusal with him. He belongs to the part of reality that civilization must respect but cannot discipline. That already makes him a deeply uncomfortable figure for a culture that prized ordered relationships between gods, kings, temples, and cities. Yet Mesopotamian religion was never so simple as to imagine order without challenge. Disorder, rebellion, flood, drought, invasion, plague, and divine anger are all present in the broader tradition. The cosmos is not a calm machine. It is something maintained against threat. Anzu becomes one of the sharpest embodiments of that threat because he is close enough to the divine order to disturb it directly. There is also something visually memorable about imagining him against the mountains. Ancient stories often become stronger when the setting explains the creature. Anzu in a field would be alarming. Anzu against dark ridges and rolling storm clouds is iconic. The mountain air belongs to him. He does not simply occupy it. He seems generated by it. You can almost see how a community might pass down that image long before any scribe committed a full version to clay. The clouds gather around the heights. Thunder rolls. A giant shape is imagined moving through the storm. The mind does the rest. That kind of image would also have helped Anzu travel across time, A myth survives partly because its central picture is strong enough to be retold. And Anzu's picture is very strong. Even in fragments, even in scholarly reconstruction, it remains clear. A monstrous storm bird associated with mountains and divine power is not difficult to remember. It has shape, it has weather, it has threat, it arrives already loaded. The old Sumerian form, Imdugud, and the Akkadian Anzu reflect that survival through different linguistic worlds. Cultural memory did not preserve every figure equally. Some disappear, some fade to local importance, some get absorbed into other traditions until their outlines blur. Anzu stayed visible, not always in the same way, and not with perfectly stable details, but visible enough to matter. That usually means a figure was useful to the imagination. People kept finding reasons to tell his story, and they likely found those reasons because Anzu could mean several things at once. He could stand for untamed weather. He could stand for a challenger to divine rule. He could stand for the danger of power without legitimacy. He could stand for mountain otherness pressing against urban order. He could stand for the terrifying idea that something outside the centre understands the centre's vulnerabilities. That is a rich bundle of meanings for one winged creature to carry. But ancient myth often works exactly that way. It gives one body to many anxieties. There is a temptation, when discussing ancient monsters, to over-modernize them by asking whether they were really symbolic or really believed as literal beings. Usually the answer is that ancient people did not divide their world the way modern people often try to. A creature could be mythic, sacred, symbolic, ritually meaningful, and in some sense real, all at once. The same culture that wrote myths also interpreted omens, performed rituals, and treated divine signs as active elements in life. So asking whether Anzu was just a metaphor misses the texture of the world he came from. He was more substantial than that. Not because every Mesopotamian expected a lion-headed eagle to crash into the local barley supply on Tuesday, but because mythic beings were part of how reality was understood. They existed in the shared mental and religious architecture of the culture. That is enough to make a creature real in a very serious way. And in Anzu's case, there is another important detail. He is not chaos in the pure abstract sense. He has shaped chaos, directed chaos, chaos with muscles and judgment. That makes him feel closer to the political world than some other monsters do. A flood may destroy everything, but it does not plan. Anzu plans. A storm may arrive, but it does not choose ambition. Anzu does. That distinction is why his physical form matters so much. The hybrid body says he is more than natural force. It says force has been personalized. Once that happens, conflict becomes inevitable. It is worth lingering on the lion component for a moment because it grounds him in an ancient language of kingship and dominance. Lions mattered symbolically across the ancient Near East. They represented strength, danger, and sovereign ferocity. Kings hunted them to demonstrate power, or at least claimed to. Gods could be associated with them. Art used them to communicate command. So giving Anzu a lion's head does more than make him look fiercer. It gives him an air of rival rule. He does not merely attack, he appears to claim. That will matter later when questions of authority come into focus, but even here, just at the level of description, it tells us what kind of bird he is. Not a scavenger, not a messenger, not a sacred pet perched politely near a god's chair. He is the avian version of a usurper waiting for a chance. And then there are the wings themselves. Wings in myth do more than allow flight. They imply access. A winged being goes where others cannot. It sees from above. It crosses terrain effortlessly. It joins realms. In Mesopotamian art and storytelling, winged figures often carry a special charge for exactly that reason. To be winged is to be more than local. It is to belong partly to the vertical axis of the cosmos. Ground creatures stay within limits. Winged creatures make a habit of ignoring them. Anzu's wings therefore make him not just fast, but cosmically mobile. He can descend from the heights, approach the domain of the gods, and depart again. He is difficult to pin down because the sky itself is his pathway. That is one reason stories about him feel tense, even before the direct confrontation begins. A land monster can be hunted. A sky creature must be anticipated. Mesopotamian myth was good at understanding that different domains create different fears. The sea brings one kind of threat, the underworld another, the desert another, the mountain and storm sky bring another still. Anzu belongs to that last category, and his nature reflects it so completely that he almost seems less like a resident of the mountains than an expression of them. He is what the high wild places look like when they become willful. There is something very old in that idea. Human beings have always projected agency onto the places that scare them most. The deep sea seems like it wants something. The forest seems like it is hiding something. The mountain storm seems like it is aimed at someone. Modern people can laugh at that tendency, usually from indoors while checking radar on a glowing screen, but the instinct has never really left. We still speak about weather in near-personal language. We still say a storm is coming for us, bearing down, gathering strength, turning. Ancient people simply took that instinct further and built a figure like Anzu from it. And once such a figure exists, the stories begin to ask harder questions. If this being lives in the heights and carries storm force, what is his relationship to the gods? Is he their servant, their creature, their rival, their mistake, their test? The answer shifts depending on the tale and the tradition, but what stays consistent is that he cannot remain a neutral presence for long. A creature with that much symbolic pressure behind it will eventually collide with the structure of divine rule. For now, though, it is enough to recognize that Anzu begins as a form of concentrated unease. He is what happens when bird, lion, mountain and thunder are fused into one figure and then placed near the edges of heaven's authority. He is distance made predatory. He is weather-given motive. He is the kind of being that ancient listeners would have understood immediately, not because they had seen him, but because they had seen enough of the world to feel why he should exist. That may be the best way to describe him. He feels earned by the landscape and the world view that produced him. He is not random. He is what the Mesopotamian imagination built when it looked up at the storm, looked east toward the mountains, thought about dangerous power, and decided that somewhere beyond the ordered life of the cities there had to be a great winged force with teeth in its intentions. Not yet the thief of destiny, not yet the cause of divine alarm, but already the sort of being whose presence makes the world feel less settled. And once a creature like that is allowed into the old stories, it is only a matter of time before he moves from distant threat into direct action, because the world of the gods before his rebellion was not a blank stage. It was a structured order, a hierarchy of powers and possessions, and in that world there was something so important that taking it would shake heaven itself. Long before Anzu made his move, before the gods were forced into panic, and before anyone had to decide who was brave enough to go after a storm bird with ideas above his station, there was a world that was meant to hold together. That is the part worth sitting with for a while, because the theft only matters if the thing being disturbed is real, structured, and valuable. Disorder is only frightening when there was some kind of order to begin with. And in Mesopotamian myth, the world of the gods before the crisis was not loose or accidental. It was arranged. It had ranks, duties, boundaries, possessions, and expectations. It may not have been peaceful in the modern sense, because ancient gods are not famous for their calm group dynamics, but it was functioning. Things were in their place. Authority had a shape. The heavens were not drifting around like a badly managed committee with no chair and no agenda. There was a hierarchy, and everyone involved understood that hierarchy mattered. That is one of the big differences between the modern way people often imagine myth and the way ancient myth usually presents itself. From a distance, mythology can look like a colourful crowd scene. Gods with unusual hats, monsters, sacred animals, heroic kings, suspiciously symbolic weather, and a great many people being told that one more improper offering could have consequences. But once you get closer, especially in Mesopotamian tradition, you start to see that myth is often deeply concerned with administration. Not just power in the dramatic sense, but power in the organised sense. Who commands, who decrees, who holds office, who enforces the order, who carries messages, who fights when that order is threatened. If that sounds surprisingly formal, that is because the civilizations of Mesopotamia were formal. Their cities ran on systems, records, labour, ritual timing, temple economies, and royal legitimacy. Their myths did not float above that world untouched. Their myths reflected it. So when we picture the divine world before Anzu acted, we should not imagine a vague cloud kingdom where everyone sat around glowing faintly. We should imagine something more structured and, in its own way, more serious. The gods were understood as powers, yes, but also as holders of roles. They governed domains, they presided over cosmic functions, they carried authority that was not interchangeable. Some were high and old, some were active and fierce, some were associated with wisdom, water, storms, fertility, judgment, kingship, warfare, writing, or the underworld. There were assemblies, decrees, and decisions. There was prestige. There were sacred objects that signified more than decoration. In other words, there was a system. The group we often speak of broadly as the Anunnaki belongs within that world of divine structure. The term shifts across time and texts, and it does not always mean exactly the same thing in every context, which is the sort of thing scholars say politely before spending years explaining why nothing ancient is ever as simple as the internet would like it to be. Still, at the broadest level, the Anunnaki are connected with the high divine order of Mesopotamian tradition, a collective of significant gods whose power is tied to rule, judgment, cosmic arrangement, and the deeper architecture of the universe. Later retellings and modern speculations do all sorts of things with that name, but in the older mythic world, what matters here is that divine rank existed. The heavens had authority. The world was not spiritually ungoverned, and that matters for Anzu because his later act is not just theft, it is interference with governance at the highest level. It helps to remember that Mesopotamian religion did not sharply separate heaven, kingship, ritual, and law into unrelated categories. Divine authority and earthly authority mirrored one another. A king wanted divine sanction because rule was not just about military success, it was about legitimacy. Temples were not mere symbolic buildings. They were points of contact between human order and divine order. Ritual was not decorative, it was maintenance. Names and ranks carried real weight. If the gods had a proper structure, that structure justified and informed the structures below. So when myth talks about order in heaven, it is also talking about the conditions that make order on earth possible. This is why sacred objects in Mesopotamian myth are often more important than they might seem to a modern reader. Today, people are used to objects being important mostly because they are useful, expensive, sentimental, or capable of charging a phone. Ancient myth had a different way of loading meaning into things. A crown is not just a hat. A scepter is not just a stick. A tablet is not just a tablet. The object can embody rule, decree, office, or access to power. That symbolic density is essential in a world where spoken command, inscribed law, and divine determination are all closely linked. So before Anzu sees the Tablet of Destinies, the tablet had to already exist as something known, guarded, and properly held. It was not a random item left unattended on a divine side table, while everyone wandered off for refreshments. It represented authority in a profound sense. It was bound up with the right to determine order, to establish what would happen, to hold the pattern of the world in legitimate hands. If you're trying to understand how serious the coming theft is, imagine not merely stealing a treasure, but stealing the right to issue reality itself. That is much closer to the scale of the problem. But before we get to that object directly, there is the question of atmosphere. What did the world feel like before it was broken? The answer is not that everything was soft, calm, and perfectly harmonious. Mesopotamian myth is too honest about power for that. The gods can be severe, they can disagree, they can punish, they can decide things that are not especially comforting from a human point of view. Flood stories do not come from divine institutions famous for endless patience. Yet even when the gods are dangerous, there is still a difference between danger inside a recognized order and danger that comes from a breach of that order. A king may be fearsome, but a kingdom with a king is not the same as a kingdom where the throne has been seized by an outsider and nobody knows whether commands still carry force. That is the distinction we're dealing with here. Before the theft, the universe had command channels. The high gods were high gods. Their stations meant something, their voices meant something. The processes by which power moved were established. There was divine routine, in the broad mythic sense. Decrees were not in dispute. Sacred possessions remained in sacred custody. The heavens may not have been cosy, but they were stable enough to operate. That kind of stability is easy to underestimate because modern people often confuse boredom with safety. Ancient cultures did not. Stability meant harvests could be hoped for. Ritual cycles could be observed. Cities could imagine tomorrow. Even if life was hard, and it often was, continuity itself was a gift. The same principle applies to the divine world in myth. A functioning order is not dull. It is the condition that allows everything else to continue. And in Mesopotamian imagination, continuation was never automatic. The world had to be sustained. The gods did not simply make reality once and wander off. Divine governance was ongoing. The heavens were not self-running. That makes the divine order feel less like a fixed backdrop and more like an active arrangement. In such a setting, the holders of cosmic authority are doing more than posing impressively. They are maintaining the framework within which events can unfold properly. There is something very old and very human in that idea. We still live by structures we do not always think about until they fail. Roads, laws, schedules, power grids, institutions, calendars, records, expectations. They fade into the background when they work. Then something breaks and suddenly everyone remembers how much was being held in place. Mesopotamian myth thinks in much the same way, just on a cosmic scale. The divine order is easy to take for granted until somebody disturbs it. And Anzu, crucially, is not going to disturb something flimsy. He's going to strike at something central. Before that strike, the divine world also had another important quality. It was exclusive. Not everyone belonged at the centre of power. Proximity to sacred authority was meaningful. Access mattered. There is a reason so many ancient myths are concerned with who may approach, who may hold, who may speak, who may enter. Boundaries are not a side issue in ritual cultures. They are one of the main ways sacredness is protected. To be near the core of divine power is itself a privilege and a danger. That makes Anzu's position especially interesting. He's not merely some beast wandering in from nowhere. He is near enough to the centre for the coming act to be possible. He is, in one way or another, within range of what matters most. That is part of what makes him frightening. The danger is not ignorance. The danger is access. There is a very particular kind of anxiety in stories where an insider or near insider turns against the structure. It always feels worse than attack from a distance. An external enemy may be strong, but an internal breach suggests vulnerability in the system itself. It raises unpleasant questions. How was he close enough? Why was he trusted, tolerated, or permitted? What did he see? What did he learn? What weakness did he recognize? These are not the questions raised by an ordinary monster. These are the questions raised by someone who knows the shape of authority well enough to target its foundation. That is why the world before the theft needs to feel solid. Not because the story wants a long, peaceful introduction, but because the eventual rupture is more dramatic if the divine order looks secure. A fortress matters more when it appears unassailable. A sacred object matters more when it appears properly guarded. A hierarchy matters more when everyone assumes it cannot easily be challenged, and it is easy to imagine why the gods themselves would think that way. High authority tends to believe in its own permanence, not always foolishly. Often it has very good reasons. It has won before. It has symbols, rituals, force, inheritance and recognition on its side. From within the centre, the structure can feel natural, even inevitable. This is true in human history, and myths understand that because myths are written by cultures who have watched power behave like that for a very long time. The centre begins to mistake endurance for invulnerability. That may be one of the quiet tensions already present before Anzu acts. The order of heaven is legitimate, but legitimacy does not make it untouchable. It makes it worth defending. Those are not the same thing. Mesopotamian myths often reveal this with great clarity. The gods are mighty, but they are not never challenged. They can be resisted, surprised, angered, or put under pressure. That does not make them weak. It makes their world dramatic. A divine order that cannot be threatened produces very short stories. A divine order that can be threatened and must be restored produces much better ones. Still, before the crisis, the atmosphere is one of functioning control. The high gods remain in place. The mechanisms of command remain intact. Sacred authority has not yet been misdirected. The world has not yet tilted. That means the basic relationships between domains remain stable. Sky gods rule the sky. Wise gods hold wisdom. Warrior gods are not yet being summoned into emergency action. The assembly is not yet in alarm. No one is yet standing around asking which among them is prepared to risk everything pursuing a storm bird into the heights. That comes later. For now, imagine the confidence of a system that has not yet discovered its weak point. The divine world of Mesopotamia also carries a legal and declarative quality that is important here. Fate in these traditions is not always some dreamy, abstract thread spinning in silence somewhere beyond the stars. It has a formal character. It can be decreed. It can be established. It can be associated with rule and rightful determination. That is why the Tablet of Destinies matters so much when it enters the story. It is not just magical because it glows in an interesting way. It is magical because it is administrative at the highest possible level. It represents the authority to set things in place. That sounds almost modern in the most alarming possible sense. A great deal of power is in practice, the power to decide outcomes before anyone else arrives. The one who sets the terms controls the field. Ancient myth understood that perfectly well. To hold the object linked with destiny is to hold more than prestige. It is to hold the capacity by which reality is ordered and recognized. So before the theft, that capacity is where it should be. It belongs to the recognized ruler. The lawful structure is intact. There is probably also a ceremonial aspect to how we should imagine this pre-theft world. Mesopotamian religion valued formality. Gods received offerings in prescribed ways. Temples embodied divine presence through structured space. Kingship itself was surrounded by symbolic acts. So it is reasonable that the highest cosmic order would not appear casual. Sacred authority would carry visible signs. There would be distinctions of status, proper places, and expected deference. Even if the myths do not always describe every detail, the cultural logic is clear. Divine rule is not messy improvisation. It is recognized order made visible. That visibility is important because it means Anzu does not act in confusion. He can see where power resides. He can tell what matters. The centre of authority is not hidden from him by irrelevance. It is obvious because authority always tries to look obvious. And perhaps there is a lesson there that ancient myth would have appreciated. The signs of power are also invitations to envy. Once something is visibly central, visibly sacred, visibly potent, it becomes imaginable as a target. The greater the object, the greater the temptation. That is as true in divine stories as it is in human courts. All of this gives the world before the theft a slightly tense dignity. It is stable, but not naive, powerful, but not beyond challenge, ordered, but only because order is being actively held. That is a more interesting kind of calm than simple peace. It is the calm of a system that works because its ranks are recognized and its sacred things remain in place. And those sacred things include not only the tablet itself, but the broader idea that cosmic rule is legitimate. The gods do not merely possess force, they possess rightful force. That distinction runs all through Mesopotamian political theology. The rightful ruler is not simply the strongest, though strength helps. The rightful ruler is the one with office, sanction, decree, and recognized authority. Take those away, and you do not just have a fight, you have a crisis of order, which is why Anzu's future act is so disruptive. He will not merely challenge a god in combat, he will challenge the framework that tells the universe who is entitled to command it. Before that happens, though, there is a deceptive stillness. The world appears arranged. The heavens are not yet shaken. The gods have not yet discovered that the system they rely on can be touched by claws from the mountains. The storm bird is still part of the scenery of danger rather than its active agent. He exists. He is powerful. He is near enough to matter. But the decisive line has not yet been crossed. That line is what changes everything. There is something almost unsettling about the moment before a crisis begins, even if no one inside the story recognizes it yet. The order feels most natural right before it is tested. The guardians feel most secure just before something slips past them. The object of power feels most permanent right before it is taken into unauthorized hands. Mesopotamian myth understands that tension very well. It lets the world stand in full authority first, because only then can it show what kind of shock follows when authority is grabbed by something that should never have held it. So the divine world before the theft is not just background. It is the standard against which everything after will be measured. It is the memory of rightful structure. It is the reason panic will matter. The reason the gods cannot simply shrug. The reason a champion will have to be found. Heaven before the breach is the world as it ought to be, at least in the eyes of those who rule it. The ranks hold. The decrees hold. The sacred object remains in sacred custody. The great powers of the cosmos still answer to the proper order. And then, somewhere within reach of that order, the stormbird is watching. He's close enough to see the centre clearly now, close enough to understand what gives the heavens their authority, close enough to recognise that one object above all others is not just precious, but foundational. A creature like Anzu was never going to be satisfied simply circling the edges forever, and once his eyes settle fully on the thing that governs destiny, the world of the gods is already standing at the edge of the moment that will break it. If Anzu himself is the kind of figure who makes ancient listeners look up at the sky with a little concern, then the Tablet of Destinies is the thing that makes them look back down and worry about the ground beneath their feet. Because a creature can be dangerous all on its own, certainly. Claws are bad. Wings the size of storms are rarely a calming sign. But there is a difference between a dangerous being and a dangerous being holding the wrong kind of power. That is where stories stop being about menace and start being about crisis. And in the Mesopotamian imagination, the Tablet of Destinies was not a small problem. To a modern ear, the name can sound almost poetic, or perhaps slightly theatrical in the way ancient sacred objects often do when translated into English. Tablet of Destinies has a grand ring to it. It sounds as though someone in a myth took the ordinary idea of a writing tablet and asked it to carry the entire weight of cosmic administration, which, to be fair, is more or less what happened. But to understand why this object mattered so much, we have to set aside the modern habit of separating symbols from reality, as though ancient people spent their lives saying, "Now, this is merely representative and should not be taken too seriously." They did not. In Mesopotamian tradition, writing, decree, order, rank, and authority were all bound tightly together. a tablet was not just clay. A tablet could hold law, judgment, ownership, command, memory, agreement, inheritance, duty, or the official version of what everyone else would now have to live with. That already gives us a clue. Mesopotamia was one of the earliest civilizations to build a world through writing, in a serious administrative sense. Long before poetry became famous, writing was keeping track of grain, labour, goods, obligations, and the little details without which a city begins to behave like a group project no one wants to manage. The written tablet mattered because it fixed things. It turned a spoken arrangement into a recorded one. It moved power out of memory alone and into an object that could be stored, cited, carried, guarded, and enforced. In that world, a sacred tablet associated with destiny was never going to feel like decoration. It was going to feel like the highest imaginable version of what tablets already did. It fixed things. Only in this case, what it fixed was not a barley delivery or a boundary line. It fixed authority itself. It fixed outcomes. It fixed the right to declare how the universe would proceed. That is why the Tablet of Destinies is best understood not as a magical trinket, but as a divine instrument of legitimate rule. It is tied to decree, to kingship at the cosmic level, to the authority by which gods govern. When properly held, it represents the order of heaven and earth operating through the correct channels. When improperly held, it represents that order being seized, bent, or thrown into uncertainty, which means it is exactly the sort of object a myth about rebellion would centre. One of the things Mesopotamian stories do especially well is turn abstract concepts into graspable forms without making them feel small. Fate could have remained an invisible principle. Authority could have remained a vague quality. Legitimacy could have floated around like an important but unhelpfully undefined force. Instead, the myths often anchor such ideas in objects, gestures, offices, and moments of possession. That is not because ancient people lacked subtlety. It is because they understood, perhaps better than many modern people do, that power is usually embodied. It sits somewhere. Someone holds it. Someone displays it. Someone protects it. Someone issues commands through it. The structure of rule becomes visible through its signs. The Tablet of Destinies is one of those signs, except at the highest possible scale, and that scale is hard to exaggerate. We're not talking about an object that helps with power. We're talking about an object that signifies and carries the power to determine order. To hold it is not just to be influential. It is to be the recognized source of what shall be. The distinction matters. In many myths, beings fight because they are strong. In this one, the deeper issue is who has the right to make strength lawful. That sounds like a very old problem, because it is. Human societies have always worried about the difference between force and legitimacy. A person can seize a throne, but does that make them king in the fullest sense? A warlord can command fear, but does that mean the gods approve? A ruler can wear the crown, but does the crown recognize the ruler? Ancient cultures ask these questions constantly, and Mesopotamia, with its close ties between divine sanction and earthly kingship, asks them with particular seriousness. The Tablet of Destinies belongs to that world of concern. It is not only about raw capacity, it is about rightful capacity. The gods do not merely rule because they are present. They rule because cosmic authority adheres to them in proper form. So when the tablet is in the right hands, the universe is ordered not just by power, but by recognized order. That means the heavens are aligned with their own logic. Decrees matter because they come from where decrees are meant to come from. The divine assembly, the ranks of the great gods, the relationships between command and obedience, heaven and earth, decree and fulfillment, all of this depends on the centre holding. And the tablet is part of that centre. It is useful here to linger on the word destinies, because modern readers often hear fate and imagine something vague, dreamy, or inevitable in a soft-focus sort of way. ancient Mesopotamian destiny is sterner than that. It is not merely the future drifting toward you because the stars have a preference. It has a legal tone, a declarative tone. Destinies are established. They are fixed. They are assigned. That means the being or beings associated with their determination stand in a position of immense authority. To determine destiny is to say what role, outcome, or order shall prevail. It is to issue structure into reality. The tablet is therefore close to a cosmic charter, a divine warrant, a concentration of rule. And because Mesopotamian religion took spoken decree very seriously, the connection between word and outcome matters here too. A god's command is not casual speech. It has force. It sets things in motion. In ritual and myth alike, the spoken word can establish realities, curses, blessings, judgments, and obligations. Writing extends that logic. A written decree is preserved authority. So a sacred tablet linked to destinies combines two powerful ideas at once, the command that orders and the record that fixes. It is authority made durable. No wonder everyone cares so much who is holding it. This also explains why the theft of the tablet is not simply symbolic in the empty sense. It is not like stealing a ceremonial sword from a display case and causing embarrassment. It is stealing the core sign and function of rule. Once the tablet leaves proper custody, the problem is immediate and severe because the relationship between office and object is broken. The one who should determine destinies no longer visibly possesses that right. The one who should never determine them now appears, at least temporarily, to have laid hold of that power. That is terrifying for exactly the same reason forged law, fake authority, or stolen seals are terrifying in more human settings. Once legitimacy is displaced, every command becomes unstable. Mesopotamian listeners would have felt that instinctively. Their world depended on seals, tablets, decrees, contracts, and properly issued orders. The temple economy did not run on vibes. The palace did not function because everyone generally meant well. Authority had to be recorded, signalled, and recognised. So when myth raises that logic to the heavens and says there exists an object tied to the right to decree destinies, ancient audiences do not have to squint very hard to understand the stakes. They know exactly what it means when the wrong hands close around the wrong tablet. Everything starts to wobble. There is also something important in the fact that it is a tablet and not, say, a weapon. Weapons appear constantly in myth. Spears, bows, maces, divine storms, enchanted nets, and the rest all have their place. They express force, they settle conflict, they prove valour. But a tablet is more interesting because it expresses governance. It says the universe is not ruled by combat alone. Even when violence enters the story, it enters in defence of order, not as the whole meaning of power. The ultimate thing being fought over is not a blade, it is authority itself. That makes the Tablet of Destinies a wonderfully Mesopotamian object. It reflects a civilization where writing, decree, and institutional rule mattered profoundly. If this myth had emerged from a culture with different core symbols, perhaps the central object would look different. Here it makes perfect sense that the highest form of power is tied to an inscribed or inscribable thing. In a world built by records, the cosmos too is imagined as something whose order can be established, held, and recognized through a tablet. And this means that when Anzu later takes it, he is not behaving like a beast. He's behaving like a usurper with administrative ambitions, which is somehow worse. There is a kind of dark humour in that. Ancient myth gives us a storm bird from the mountains, a creature of wings, talons, and lion force, and instead of simply having him smash things noisily, it has him target the constitutional basis of divine rule. That is a very sophisticated move for a monster. He is not just a threat to bodies, he is a threat to governance. He understands, or is presented as understanding, that the object worth stealing is not the biggest pile of treasure. It is the thing that authorises command. That detail transforms the whole story. It also tells us something about how Mesopotamian thinkers imagined order itself. Order was not natural in the simple sense. It did not just happen because the universe was in a good mood. It had to be established, recognized, and maintained. The Tablet of Destinies is one way of expressing that maintenance. It says that cosmic arrangement depends on rightful possession of authority. Remove that authority from its proper place, and order does not politely wait until everyone sorts things out. It becomes vulnerable. This vulnerability is what gives the tablet such weight. A truly central object in myth reveals what a culture thinks cannot safely be compromised. The Egyptians often emphasize kingship, ma'at, and continuity. Other traditions emphasize sacred fire, ancestral law, or divine weapons. Mesopotamia, in this case, says something revealing. The dangerous breach is the breach of decree. The universe depends on rightful determination. Therefore, the object that embodies rightful determination must never fall into the wrong hands. And yet, of course, it does. That is for a little later. Before that, we should stay with what the tablet means when everything is still functioning as intended. Imagine the divine world before the crisis. The great gods are in place. The channels of authority remain intact. The one who holds the tablet holds not just prestige, but the visibly recognized basis for command. The divine assembly operates under a known hierarchy. Heaven has a center. Earth, insofar as it depends on heaven, is aligned under that structure. The tablet is one of the ways this arrangement is anchored. It is less a gadget than a guarantee. Guarantees, however, only feel invisible while they hold. That is true in human life too. People rarely wake each morning overwhelmed by gratitude that basic systems continue to function. They mostly notice systems when they fail. Electricity, records, borders, institutions, schedules, passwords, roads, the quiet agreements that make shared life possible. The more central something is, the less often you think about it until someone breaks it. The Tablet of Destinies works similarly in the mythic imagination. It sits at the centre precisely because it stabilises the rest. That centrality is what makes its loss catastrophic. There is another subtle point worth noticing. The tablet governs heaven and earth, not in the sense that it physically pushes clouds around or rotates the planet like a very sacred lever. Ancient myths are usually more conceptually elegant than that. It governs because it authorises order. It secures the pattern by which things are rightly arranged. The ruler who possesses it does not need to personally flap every bird and move every river. Rather, possession of the tablet means the ruler is the locus of rightful decree. Through that right, the cosmos is set and maintained. This is why the coming theft causes such panic among the gods. Not because they are irrationally attached to office supplies, but because the tablet is the visible concentration of the very thing that makes divine rule coherent. If it can be stolen, then legitimacy can be interrupted. If legitimacy can be interrupted, then the order of heaven and earth is not self-protecting. If the order of heaven and earth is not self-protecting, then every lesser arrangement below it becomes uncertain. And that is exactly the sort of chain reaction myth loves. The tablet also bridges two worlds at once, the divine and the human. In heaven, it is an object of cosmic rule. On earth, it reflects how power already works in city life. That bridge is one of the reasons the story has such staying power. It is not only about gods, it is about recognizable structure. A listener in ancient Mesopotamia may never have seen the divine assembly, but they had seen records, decrees, seals, offices, rank, and the consequences of administrative breakdown. They knew what it meant for the proper holder of authority to matter. So the tablet would have felt both awe-inspiring and intelligible. It is always easier to build grand myth from familiar logic than from total abstraction. The same civilizations that kept careful records of land and labour could imagine a cosmos where the highest authority was likewise tied to formal determination. In that sense, the Tablet of Destinies is not strange at all. It is the universe imagined through the administrative genius and anxiety of Mesopotamian culture. Reality itself has been given a governing document because Mesopotamia knew what documents did. And if that sounds dry, the myth is kind enough to add a giant storm bird. Still, the seriousness remains. The tablet is not merely the prize in a contest. It is the standard by which authority is recognized. That means whoever holds it stands, at least for the moment, in a relation to power that affects every other being. The consequences are cosmic because the object is constitutional. It governs by making rule rightful and effective. This also explains why the tablet's existence makes the gods themselves more interesting. They are not absolute in a flat sense. They exist within an order that has forms, objects, signs, and procedures. Even the highest divine power appears through recognizable modes of legitimacy. That gives the mythology texture. It means the world is not held together by sheer arbitrary whim. There is a structure, and that structure can be guarded or breached. Anzu, by setting his eyes on the tablet, reveals that he understands where the structure can be breached, and that turns him from a monster of weather into a monster of insight. He is not merely violent, he is precise. The theft to come will not be random destruction. It will be targeted disruption of the very mechanism that governs heaven and earth. That is why the tablet deserves this long pause. Without understanding its importance, one might think the later panic is exaggerated. With understanding, the panic becomes the only reasonable response, because imagine it from the god's point of view. The object that confirms the rightful order of the cosmos, the object tied to decree, rank, and destiny itself, is suddenly within reach of a being who does not belong on the throne. A being of the storm, a being from the heights, a being who represents force without proper sanction. If he takes it, then heaven does not simply lose a possession, heaven loses the visible centre of lawful command. That is the kind of crisis from which myths are built. It is also, quietly, the kind of crisis from which states are built, laws are built, and institutions are built. The fear that order depends on rightful custody. The fear that the wrong holder can change outcomes for everyone. The fear that legitimacy once seized becomes harder to distinguish from legitimacy once earned. These are ancient concerns, but not dead ones. The Tablet of Destinies gives them a form ancient listeners could grasp immediately. And perhaps that is why the object still feels powerful now. Not because anyone expects to find it in an archaeological trench tucked beside a receipt for temple goats, but because it speaks to an enduring truth. The deepest forms of power are often the ones that define what counts as rightful. Whoever holds that power does not just act. They set the terms under which all other action is judged. So before Anzu's claws ever close around it, before the heavens realize what has happened, the Tablet of Destinies stands at the center of divine order, like a fixed point that everyone assumes will remain fixed. It is the authority behind authority, the decree behind decrees, the sacred confirmation that heaven still governs earth in the proper way. And that is exactly why a stormbird with ambition does not aim for anything smaller, because once you understand what the tablet is, you understand that taking it is not theft in the ordinary sense. It is a bid to redirect the universe itself, and the moment Anzu reaches for it, the old order is already standing one breath away from being broken. By the time Anzu acted, the danger was no longer theoretical. He was no longer just the stormbird in the mountains, the great winged presence associated with wild heights, violent weather, and the uneasy feeling that power at the edge of the world might one day move toward the centre. He had seen enough. He was close enough. He understood enough. And in Mesopotamian myth, that is often the moment when a creature stops being an image and becomes an event. Because there is a difference between a threat that exists and a threat that chooses its time. Anzu chose his time. That detail matters more than it might seem. Ancient stories often make rebellion memorable not only by what is done, but by when it is done. The timing reveals intention. A wild beast may attack because it is hungry, cornered, or simply built that way. A usurper waits. A usurper studies. A usurper acts when the structure of power is exposed just enough to be touched. The theft of the Tablet of Destinies is told as exactly that kind of act. Not random violence, not storm damage, not some great feathered confusion in the wrong sacred corridor. This is a strike. And because it is a strike, it carries a different kind of fear. Brute force is frightening, certainly, but calculated force is more disturbing because it suggests understanding. Anzu is not merely strong enough to make trouble. He is perceptive enough to know where trouble will matter most. He does not tear at the edges of the divine world. He reaches for its centre. In the old tradition, the moment often comes when the great god entrusted with the tablet is at ease, or at least not expecting betrayal. The details vary in surviving versions and reconstructions, as old myths tend to do, but the shape of the event is clear enough. The holder of authority is exposed for a moment. The sacred object is near. The order of heaven is functioning in the ordinary confidence of its own continuity. And Anzu, who should never have had his claws anywhere near the thing, takes it. It is hard to improve on that as a plot move, but to feel why it shook the divine realm, it helps to imagine the act from several angles at once. From Anzu's point of view, this is the instant when possibility becomes action. He is no longer only near power, he is in contact with it. Every mythic usurper has a threshold moment like that, the instant before the line is crossed and then the instant after, when the world is no longer what it was a breath earlier. Once the tablet is in his grasp, nothing remains safely theoretical. He has not merely challenged authority, he has disrupted its location. The sign and function of rightful decree are no longer where they belong. From the god's point of view, the shock is immediate for the same reason. The unthinkable has happened in a way that proves the unthinkable was possible all along. That is always a frightening discovery. Systems do not only fear attack, they fear the revelation that they were attackable. The theft of the tablet is not just loss, it is exposure. It tells the divine assembly that their order, however ancient and sacred, can be breached by a being from outside the proper chain of command. And from the point of view of the myth itself, the theft is perfect because it transforms every earlier idea about Anzu into action. The bird of the mountains, the creature of storm and height, the hybrid of lion force and sky power, now proves that he is also a rebel. Everything about his nature converges in this one act. He is elevated and violent, remote and ambitious, associated with the atmosphere yet now entering the chamber of rule. He does what only a being like him could do. One of the more fascinating elements in this old story is that Anzu does not seize a weapon first. He does not begin by scattering the divine court with raw physical destruction. He takes the thing that governs power before he relies on power itself. That tells us again that this is not a simple monster tale. It is a tale of usurpation. The storm bird thinks like a challenger to kingship. He understands that to shake heaven, you do not begin by clawing the furniture. You begin by seizing legitimacy, which is somehow more offensive than just breaking everything. There is a certain grim intelligence in that choice. Even now, people understand instinctively that possession changes perception. The moment someone holds the symbol of office, the seal, the decree, the code, the crown, the keys, the document that makes authority visible, everyone else is forced into uncertainty. The question is no longer simply who is strongest. The question becomes who now appears entitled to command. And myths thrive on that uncertainty because it is so corrosive. Once legitimacy is in dispute, every action taken afterward feels unstable. That is what Anzu creates with the theft. He injects instability into the highest level of divine order. It is worth dwelling on the act itself in a quiet, deliberate way, because it is easy to rush past it as though the important part is only the battle that follows. But the theft is in many ways the most revealing moment in the whole story. It shows us what Anzu wants, what he dares, and what the myth considers most vulnerable. He wants more than treasure. He wants rule. Or at least he wants the basis by which rule becomes real. This is what separates him from a merely chaotic being. Chaos may destroy, but it does not always aspire. Anzu aspires. He reaches upward, not just outward. He does not attack at random. He takes the one thing that can reorder the whole field. That is ambition in its oldest mythic form. Not the desire to survive, not the desire to feed, the desire to occupy the centre. And there is something about that desire which ancient cultures always find both terrifying and magnetic. The usurper is dangerous, but he is also fascinating because he does what others only imagine. He breaks the assumption that power stays where it was placed. He proves that height can be climbed, that sacred custody can fail, that the centre may not be as untouchable as it appears. Even if the myth condemns him, and it does, it still grants him that electric quality all memorable rebels possess. He is the one who acted. Of course, acting and succeeding are not the same thing in the long run, but in the moment of theft, Anzu has succeeded enough to shatter confidence, and that is why the divine realm shakes. When the holder of the tablet loses it, the crisis is not personal embarrassment, it is structural disturbance. The order that governed heaven and earth has been interrupted at the point of lawful possession. Imagine the stunned realization. The object that should define authority is no longer resting in the recognized hands of divine rule. It is moving away in the grasp of a storm creature. It is being carried into the heights, toward the wild places, toward the margins that were never meant to become the seat of command. That image alone is enough to explain the panic that comes next. The tablet leaving the proper centre is like watching the axes of a wheel suddenly detach while the cart is still in motion. Even if the whole thing does not collapse immediately, every part of it is now in danger. And because Anzu is a sky creature, the theft gains an added layer of dread. He does not simply steal and hide in a room. He can escape vertically. He can take the tablet into his own domain, the storm-dark upper spaces where pursuit is difficult and certainty is worse. A ground-bound thief can be chased in direct lines. A storm bird fleeing with the authority of heaven is another matter. The sky itself becomes an accomplice. This makes the act feel even more humiliating to the divine order. The centre has not only been breached, it has been outmanoeuvred. The sacred object is not lying dropped in a corridor while guards scramble. It has gone into distance, into altitude, into the dangerous geography that made Anzu frightening from the beginning. The mountains and storms that once framed him as a symbolic threat now become the setting of his advantage. That is very good storytelling. The myth has spent time associating him with remote, elevated force, and now that force matters practically. He steals as a creature of his own environment. The heavens are not prepared to be robbed by something that can vanish toward the very edge of their controlled order. There is another quiet cruelty in the theft as well. By taking the tablet, Anzu does not simply weaken a god. He interrupts the confidence of everyone beneath that god's authority. The divine world is hierarchical. The gods know rank. They know proper channels. When the topmost sign of decree is taken, the uncertainty spreads downward immediately. If the source of authority has been displaced, what now guarantees the rest? Who speaks with unquestioned force? Whose decree still stands beyond dispute? Who is now acting under rightful order? And who is merely hoping the old order still counts? These are disastrous questions in any structured system. In a mythic cosmos, they are worse, and old Mesopotamian listeners would have understood that instinctively. A city does not like uncertain authority. A temple does not like uncertain authority. A kingdom certainly does not like uncertain authority. Everyone wants to know where legitimate command rests, because daily life depends on that answer. The theft turns that human truth into divine drama. Suddenly, heaven itself faces the kind of crisis that earthly institutions fear most. The visible centre has been compromised. It is not hard to imagine how the myth would have landed in a culture so invested in kingship, temple order, proper decrees, and cosmic hierarchy. Anzu's act is not just exciting, it is offensive in a deep cultural way. It overturns the expected relationship between sacred office and sacred possession. The one who should never possess the instrument of destinies now holds it. That is not merely wrong, it is destabilizing in principle. And the story wants us to feel that destabilization immediately. It is possible that part of Anzu's power in the myth comes from the way he combines two ancient anxieties at once. He is both outside and inside. Outside because he belongs to the mountains, the storm, the wild upper reaches beyond ordinary city order. Inside because he's been close enough to sacred authority to take what matters most. Those two conditions together make him the perfect rebel. A complete outsider could threaten from afar but not strike the centre so precisely. A complete insider might know the system but not embody the raw wild force needed to challenge it with such dramatic scale. Anzu is both. He is the edge that has learned the centre. That is why his theft feels so dangerous. It is not only a robbery, it is a collapse of categories. The wild has touched the lawful. The margins have seized the centre. The creature of weather has taken the instrument of decree. Once that happens, the world of the gods cannot pretend nothing fundamental has changed. And perhaps the strangest thing about the act is that it must have taken nerve. However myth frames Anzu, however monstrous or rebellious he appears, there is no version of this story in which he accidentally ends up holding the most sacred object of authority. He chooses, he risks, he crosses the line knowingly. Ancient stories often punish that kind of audacity, but they also acknowledge it. They give it shape because it reveals something essential about the challenger. Anzu is not timid. He does not circle forever. He does not remain a warning in the mountains. He commits. That makes the theft the moment he becomes unforgettable. The heavens, meanwhile, are forced into the opposite state, uncertainty. The gods who lived within a structured order must now confront an unstructured emergency. Their confidence is broken before their strategy is even formed. Something that should never have happened has happened, and the first response to that is rarely elegant. It is shock. It is disbelief. It is the horrible pause in which everyone realizes that the old assumptions have already failed. The divine realm shakes, not because the tablet emits theatrical sparks at a dramatically inconvenient moment, though ancient poets would certainly be forgiven for enjoying the scene. It shakes because the meaning of the act reverberates instantly. If destinies are attached to the rightful holder, then what happens when the rightful holder is dispossessed? If decree is bound to legitimate office, what becomes of decree when the sign of office flies off in the claws of a rebel? If heaven governs earth through order, what happens when order is momentarily captured by storm? These are not small questions. They are the whole problem. There is also a psychological element to the theft that should not be overlooked. The gods are not only confronting loss, they are confronting insult. Authority hates being mocked, and there is something profoundly mocking about a great storm bird from the heights stealing the most sacred object in the cosmos. It is not just defeat, it is humiliation. The old order looks exposed, vulnerable, and perhaps too sure of itself. Anzu has proven that the centre can be surprised. Myths often preserve that kind of humiliation, because it sharpens the need for response. A slight can be ignored, an attack can sometimes be contained, but an insult to authority, especially public or obvious authority, demands answer. The divine assembly cannot quietly move on. It cannot issue a polite internal review and hope nobody noticed. The tablet is gone, the breach is total. Someone must act. And for the moment, no one has yet acted. That is what makes the aftermath of the theft so tense. The strike happens first. The solution does not arrive immediately. There is a gap between disaster and response, and that gap is one of the most powerful spaces in myth. It allows fear to spread. It allows the meaning of the loss to settle. It allows heaven to feel, briefly and perhaps for the first time in a very direct way, what it is like when the foundation of its authority has been carried beyond reach. Anzu, meanwhile, has done what no mere beast could have done. He has turned himself into a claimant, whether he has the wisdom to hold what he stole or not, and that distinction matters too. There are many figures in myth who are capable of taking power, but not of ruling with it. Taking is one skill, holding is another, governing is another still. The act of theft does not guarantee long-term legitimacy, but it does guarantee immediate crisis. The old order now has a problem it cannot postpone. The storm bird has struck, the tablet is gone, the lawful pattern of rule has been interrupted, the heavens have been shown their weak point. In the sharp silence after that realization, the divine realm is no longer standing in its old confidence. It is standing in alarm, in outrage, and in a kind of sacred disbelief that quickly hardens into urgency. Because once the Tablet of Destinies has left the proper hands, delay becomes danger, and the gods who were certain of their order a moment ago now have to face a much more uncomfortable question. With heaven itself shaken, who among them is willing to answer the stormbird at all? Once Anzu had the Tablet of Destinies, the problem was too large for anyone in the divine world to pretend it might settle down on its own. There are some disturbances you can contain, there are some insults you can absorb, there are even some rebellions that can be left at the edges for a while, especially if they are local, temporary or inconvenient in a way that does not threaten the structure holding everything else together. This was not one of those cases. The stormbird had not stolen a treasure chest, or a ceremonial badge, or one of those objects that is very sacred until it goes missing, and then suddenly everyone says the real sacredness was the friendships they made along the way. He had taken the thing that marked and carried cosmic authority itself. That meant the question before the gods was no longer whether Anzu was troublesome. The question was whether heaven still had a clear centre, while he remained in possession of what he had seized. That is the kind of question that makes an assembly nervous very quickly. And Mesopotamian myth understands assemblies very well. The divine assembly is not just a group scene, it is a political scene. It is where rank becomes visible, where authority is tested, where decisions must be made in the presence of others who know exactly what is at stake. Ancient cultures loved councils, thrones, official gatherings, and formal scenes of decision, because those scenes reveal a great deal about how power actually works. People like to imagine rule as simple when they are outside it. From inside, it is usually a matter of reputation, hierarchy, caution, obligation, and the unpleasant fact that once a crisis begins, everyone starts looking at everyone else to see who intends to do something expensive. That is the mood we should imagine here. The assembly is not calm. It cannot be calm. The theft has already proven too much. It has shown that sacred authority can be displaced. It has shown that a being from the margins, a storm creature from the heights, has not only dared to challenge the divine order, but has touched its centre and escaped with it. The gods are therefore faced with a double injury. They have suffered loss, certainly, but they have also suffered exposure. The structure they relied on has been shown to have a weak point. Once that happens, panic is not an overreaction. Panic is the first honest response to an order discovering that it is not as protected as it thought. Now, panic in a divine assembly does not necessarily look like human panic in a crowded train station when someone announces unexpected delays and half the room immediately decides to stand up for no useful reason. Divine panic is more formal than that. It has rank. It has silence in the wrong places. It has angry questions. It has the sharp recognition that no one wants to say the worst possibility aloud until somebody has to. Ancient myths often capture this beautifully. The gods are powerful, but power does not cancel alarm. In some ways it intensifies it, because those at the top understand the stakes more clearly than anyone else, and the stakes are not small. If Anzu holds the Tablet of Destinies, then he is not merely hidden away with stolen property. He is in possession of the visible sign and effective basis of decree. That means the usual order of command is no longer secure. Even if heaven has not collapsed physically, even if the sky has not fallen in sheets, and the earth has not immediately come apart, the structure has still been interrupted at its most sensitive point. And in a world where legitimacy matters, interruption is enough to cause crisis. The centre does not have to vanish completely to become uncertain. It only has to become contestable. That is what the gods cannot ignore. The Stormbird is not a nuisance. He's a live challenge to rightful power. Leave him alone, and you do not simply tolerate rebellion. You normalise the idea that the basis of divine authority can be taken and held by force. That would be disastrous, not only because of what Anzu might do next, but because of what his continued possession would mean. If he remains unchallenged, then every lesser power in the cosmos learns a dangerous lesson. The centre can be breached. The sacred object can be stolen. The assembly can be shocked into hesitation. The old order can be robbed and then left standing there trying to look dignified about it. No hierarchy survives that kind of lesson very well. This is one of the reasons the assembly's panic is so immediate and so serious. The gods are not only worried about practical consequences, they are worried about symbolic consequences, and in the ancient world, symbols are practical consequences. The sign of rule is not secondary to rule, it is one of the ways rule exists. If the visible concentration of authority is now in the claws of a rebel, then authority itself begins to look compromised. You cannot easily tell the universe to carry on as normal while the Stormbird is flying around with destiny under his arm, or under his wing, or however one transports cosmic legitimacy, when one is also a giant lion-headed eagle. And this is precisely where the old Mesopotamian sense of order becomes so important. These myths emerge from cultures that cared deeply about proper structure. Cities depended on clear offices, kingship depended on sanction, temple life depended on sequence and ritual correctness, and administration depended on records and recognised channels. Disorder was not some interesting alternative management style. Disorder was crop loss, labour failure, legal confusion, broken hierarchy, divine displeasure, and a rapid decline in everybody's confidence. So when that concern is translated into myth, the gods react exactly as such a culture would expect them to react. They do not shrug and say perhaps Anzu has an important new perspective on governance. They panic because governance is what is under attack. There is also a very simple reason they cannot ignore him. He has already succeeded once. That fact changes everything. Before the theft, Anzu could be imagined as dangerous in potential. After the theft, he is dangerous in proof. He has not merely threatened to seize the centre, he has done it. He has not merely hinted at rebellion, he has executed it. The assembly is therefore not dealing with speculation, it is dealing with evidence. The Stormbird has demonstrated reach, daring, and timing. He knew when to strike, what to take, and how to escape. That makes him more alarming than a blunt force adversary. A blunt force adversary may be terrifying, but at least everyone understands the problem. Anzu is worse because he has shown intelligence aimed at the structure itself. This is why divine panic becomes almost inevitable. Once an enemy proves both strength and precision, delay begins to look like weakness. And assemblies, whether human or divine, are especially sensitive to weakness once it has become visible. Every member of the group is now asking two questions at once. First, how bad is this really? Second, who is going to deal with it? The first question produces fear. The second produces discomfort. Because dealing with Anzu is not a routine task. The being who goes after him will not be sent to settle a border dispute or tidy up a ritual misunderstanding. They will be sent against the Stormbird who already breached the centre of heaven and escaped with the basis of cosmic order. This is not a task people volunteer for lightly. Heroic myth likes brave champions, but before the hero steps forward, there is often a perfectly understandable silence in the room. Courage is admirable, it is also expensive, and the assembly at this stage is not yet in resolution. It is still in reaction. We should not imagine the gods as foolish for panicking. In fact, their panic shows a kind of intelligence. They understand immediately that the crisis is not local. A lesser problem could be delegated quietly or handled through routine force. This one cannot. The theft has implications for every god whose place depends on the larger structure remaining intact. If the holder of destinies is displaced, then rank itself is under pressure, decree itself is under pressure. The assembly is therefore not acting out of wounded pride alone, though there is certainly wounded pride involved. It is acting because the conditions that make the divine hierarchy intelligible have been shaken, and of course there is anger too, a great deal of it. Anger enters because Anzu has done more than steal. He has insulted the divine order. Power can forgive many things more readily than humiliation. A lost battle can sometimes be avenged. A difficult enemy can sometimes be respected. But exposure, especially exposure of vulnerability, cuts much deeper. The gods have been made to look breachable. The sacred centre has been handled by the wrong being. That is not merely inconvenient, it is offensive at the level of status, and status matters enormously in hierarchical worlds. The assembly cannot ignore that offence because to ignore it would be to accept it. There is also the practical matter that the Tablet of Destinies in Anzu's possession is not stable, simply because he has it. The longer he holds it, the more dangerous the situation becomes. Myths do not always spell out every procedural consequence in modern, administrative language, and perhaps that is for the best, because minutes from emergency Divine Committee meeting regarding catastrophic avian governance breach would lose some of the grandeur. Still, the logic is clear. If the tablet is bound to decree and rule, then its continued possession by Anzu keeps the crisis alive. The emergency does not fade with time. Time feeds it. That means the assembly is under pressure not only to act, but to act before hesitation becomes part of the disaster. There is a very specific kind of fear in councils faced with sudden crisis. At first everyone is shocked. Then everyone realizes that the shock itself is taking time. Then the realization that time is passing becomes a second panic layered on top of the first. Now the problem is no longer only what happened. The problem is that it happened, and no response has yet been made. In a well-run order, that is intolerable. In a divine order, it is humiliating. Mesopotamian myth is especially alert to this because it is born from a world where authority is expected to respond. Kings must judge, priests must perform, officials must issue. Even the gods in myth must decide. A frozen assembly would feel unnatural in such a cultural setting, so panic must move towards strategy. But before it can do that, it must fully register why Anzu cannot simply be left in the mountains with his stolen prize. One reason is cosmic. One reason is political. One reason is symbolic. And all three are the same reason in different clothing. Cosmically, the universe depends on rightful order. Politically, rightful order depends on recognized authority. Symbolically, recognized authority depends on visible possession of what marks and carries rule. The tablet sits exactly at the crossing point of those three things. Therefore, whoever holds it threatens all three at once. That is why the gods cannot decide to wait until Anzu becomes more cooperative. He is already too dangerous by existing in possession of the tablet. There is another factor as well, one that often appears in myths of rebellion and usurpation. Success attracts possibility. If Anzu can do this, what else might follow? Even if no secondary rebellion immediately appears, the imagination of the assembly will move there. Could other powers align with him? Could fear spread? Could obedience falter? Could the old order begin to look old in the worst possible way, not venerable, but weakened? A centre under challenge is never judged only by the first challenge. It is judged by what that challenge might invite. The gods know this. That is another reason their panic is not merely emotional, it is anticipatory. And then there is the matter of who Anzu is. If the thief were some minor creature, an accidental trespasser, perhaps even a reckless but limited enemy, the response could be more measured. But Anzu is a storm bird associated with mountain heights, wild weather, and hybrid ferocity. He already belongs to the register of things that feel larger than ordinary opposition. He's difficult to pursue because his geography favours him. He's difficult to dismiss because his nature already suggests magnitude. A dangerous object in the hands of a dangerous being is always worse than a dangerous object in the hands of a fool, because the fool may lose it before he knows what it means. Anzu, by contrast, has shown purpose. That purpose makes him impossible to ignore. The assembly therefore enters the very old pattern of power under threat. First comes the recognition that a line has been crossed. Then comes the shared realization that this line cannot be allowed to stand. Then comes the much less enjoyable phase in which everyone has to confront the cost of restoring what has been broken. Myth often compresses these moments, but their logic is clear. Panic is the bridge between injury and action. It is the emotional proof that the problem has been understood at its real size. That is why the god's alarm is not weakness, it is comprehension. And perhaps the most unsettling part is that Anzu has forced the assembly into a reactive posture. Before the theft, the divine world stood as the centre from which order flowed outward. Now it must respond to a challenge set by someone else. The Stormbird has chosen the moment, the target, and the terms of disruption. Heaven is no longer directing events with full confidence, it is answering them. That reversal alone would be enough to disturb any hierarchy. The centre prefers to initiate, not scramble. This is another reason they cannot ignore him. To ignore him would be to accept reactivity as the new condition of divine rule. It would mean the centre is no longer truly central. The margins would have imposed the pace of events. A being from the wild heights would have made heaven answer to him. No sacred assembly could tolerate that for long without ceasing to look like an assembly worth obeying. And so the panic is not pointless noise. It is the sound of the divine realm grasping what has happened in full. The Stormbird is now a constitutional crisis with wings. The gods do not merely dislike him. They cannot absorb him into the old order without undoing the old order's claim to legitimacy. He has taken the one thing that proves rule should remain where it has always remained. Until that is reversed, nothing is safely settled. One can imagine the tension in the room, if a divine assembly can be described as a room without anyone objecting too much. The anger is there, the shock is there, the insult is there. But beneath all of it is a colder realization. Somebody must go after him, not eventually, not after a long review process and several strongly worded heavenly memoranda. Soon. The crisis is too central, too visible, and too dangerous to leave unattended. And yet that realization creates the next problem immediately, because once everyone agrees the Stormbird cannot be ignored, the assembly is forced into a much more uncomfortable question. Agreement is easy compared to selection. It is one thing for the gods to know that Anzu must be answered. It is another to determine which among them is strong enough, bold enough, and sufficiently willing to climb into the storm and take the Tablet of Destinies back from the creature who stole it. Once the assembly had fully understood that Anzu could not be ignored, the next problem arrived almost at once, and it was in some ways even less comfortable than panic. Panic at least allows everyone to feel the same thing together. It has a kind of shared urgency to it. A crisis has happened. The structure is shaken. The sacred object is gone. Everyone agrees the situation is intolerable. That part, strangely enough, can be almost easy. The harder part begins the moment agreement has to become action, because action requires a name. Someone has to go. And the moment a divine assembly reaches that point, the mood changes. It is no longer enough to be alarmed, or indignant, or eloquent about the sanctity of order. Now the question turns sharp. Which god will face the Stormbird? Which power will rise from the formal circle of outrage and carry the responsibility into the mountains, into the storm, into the dangerous height where Anzu has taken the Tablet of Destinies, and with it the visible right to command? The crisis has to move out of discussion and into risk, and that is the point where assemblies become very revealing. Because there is a difference between approving a mission and being the mission. Ancient myths understand this perfectly. They understand that councils often speak bravely in the abstract. They understand that urgency can fill a room, yet leave uncertainty hanging over the one practical issue that matters most. Someone must be chosen, and not just anyone. The being sent against Anzu cannot be symbolic, ceremonial, or merely senior enough to look impressive in divine seating arrangements. The chosen one must be able to fight, must be able to pursue, must be able to stand against a hybrid storm creature already empowered by his own audacity and fortified by what he has stolen. That narrows the field very quickly, and so the search begins. It is worth slowing down here, because this part of the story is not filler before the battle. It tells us something essential about the gods, and about how Mesopotamian myth thinks power works. If the assembly has to search for a champion, that means not every god is automatically suited to every crisis. Authority is not the same as combat. Wisdom is not the same as ferocity. Rank is not the same as battlefield usefulness. A being may be high, ancient, lawful, or deeply revered, and still not be the one to send into direct confrontation with a mountain stormbird who has already embarrassed the heavens once. That distinction matters. Modern people sometimes flatten ancient pantheons into a collection of super beings, as though all the gods were just different flavours of unlimited capability. But old myth is usually more textured than that. The gods are powerful, yes, but their powers differ. Their temperaments differ. Their functions differ. Their reputations differ. One may govern, another may advise, another may create, another may rage, another may judge, another may heal, and another may fight. A crisis does not erase those differences. In fact, it makes them more important. The assembly cannot simply point at the nearest divine figure and hope for the best. They need the right kind of power. And the right kind of power is not easy to find. That alone helps explain why the search for a champion matters so much in the story. The gods have already learned that Anzu is not a simple enemy. He is strong, cunning, elevated, and in possession of the Tablet of Destinies. He has geography in his favour and symbolism in his claws. He is not waiting politely at a convenient distance from the capital of heaven for someone to challenge him at a reasonable hour. He is in the heights, in the wild, in his own atmosphere. Whoever goes against him must be willing to leave the security of the divine centre and enter the space where Anzu is most dangerous. And naturally this makes the room a little quieter. One of the most human things in mythology is the way even divine gatherings can hesitate when the cost of courage becomes specific. It is easy to praise bravery in general. It is harder to volunteer once everyone understands exactly what bravery will require. This does not mean the gods are cowards. It means the story is intelligent enough to recognise that real danger commands respect. Anzu is not the sort of opponent one dismisses with a wave and a speech. He has already done the impossible once. Anyone facing him must assume he is capable of more. So the assembly begins to consider, who among the gods has the necessary strength? Who has the reputation of a warrior? Who can move from council to combat without becoming uncertain halfway up the mountain? Who can not only fight, but fight under conditions altered by the theft itself? This last point is crucial because Anzu's possession of the Tablet of Destinies means the confrontation will not happen under ordinary circumstances. The cosmos has been shaken at the level of decree. The enemy is no longer merely violent. He is temporarily backed by the sign of lawful authority, even though he does not rightfully possess it. That makes him more dangerous than a monster in the wild. It makes him a rebel whose challenge has touched the architecture of rule. To put it plainly, the champion is being asked to fight someone who is both physically formidable and cosmically disruptive. That is not a casual assignment. Mesopotamian myth often gives real weight to this sort of selection process. The search for the right champion is never just about power levels. To borrow a very modern phrase that ancient scribes would probably have found both useful and irritating. It is about suitability. The right champion must embody the answer to the crisis. If the problem is disorder, the champion must restore order. If the problem is rebellion, the champion must represent rightful force. If the problem is a challenge from the margins, the champion must carry the authority of the centre without seeming fragile or merely administrative. In other words, the chosen god must be more than strong. He must be the correct kind of strong. This is where warrior gods become indispensable. In the Mesopotamian world, warrior divinities are not just violent for the sake of spectacle. They're often instruments of order. Their combat matters because it is directed. They do not merely hit things. They answer threats to divine and earthly structure. That makes them ideal candidates in stories like this. But even among warrior figures there are questions. Who is fierce enough? Who is dependable enough? Who can bear the burden of representing heaven in the field? Who can be sent not only to defeat Anzu, but to undo the insult he represents? Because defeating Anzu will not just be military success, it will be restoration. This is why the search for a champion is also, quietly, a search for a repair to legitimacy. The Assembly needs someone who can do more than retrieve the tablet. They need someone who can prove, through action, that the old order was not permanently displaced. The chosen one must visibly stand for the return of rightful command. He must be strong enough to act, but also aligned enough to restore the cosmic arrangement that Anzu violated. That places a special burden on the one selected. He will not simply be hunting a thief. He will be bearing the honour of the gods. He will be carrying their answer to humiliation. He will be stepping into a mythic role larger than combat alone. The Assembly is not merely seeking a capable fighter. It is seeking a figure who can become the correction to a universal wrong. And that makes the pause before selection all the more understandable. One can imagine the weight of names being considered. Some gods are powerful, but not suited to this kind of direct violent confrontation. Some may be wise, but wisdom is not always what the mountains listen to in the middle of a storm. Some may be high in rank, but the higher the rank, the greater the danger of loss if they fall. Sending the wrong god could deepen the crisis beyond repair. If the chosen champion fails, Anzu's theft becomes even more catastrophic. The gods would not only have lost the Tablet of Destinies, they would have demonstrated that their best answer was insufficient. That possibility must have hung heavily over the Assembly, and it helps explain why stories like this take time to build toward the champion. The selection is not ceremonial, it is strategic. In myths where the stakes are cosmic, the wrong hero is not just a narrative inconvenience, he is a disaster. The Assembly therefore has every reason to hesitate, weigh and seek the god whose nature fits the task most precisely. There is also another dimension to the search, one that ancient listeners would likely have felt without needing it explained outright. The chosen champion must want the role, or at least accept it with full commitment. A reluctant emissary does not make a good mythic restorer of order. The Assembly can appoint someone, certainly, but the story gains force when the chosen one embraces the responsibility. The crisis then becomes personal as well as cosmic. The god does not merely obey, he rises. That is why so many ancient heroic selections involve persuasion, encouragement, or some moment in which the chosen figure is addressed as though the world depends on his answer. Because it does. Imagine the Assembly at that point. The air is still tense from the theft. The outrage has not cooled. The insult remains fresh. Every god present knows the tablet must be reclaimed. Every god also knows that reclaiming it will involve risk of the highest kind. To move against Anzu is to leave the order of the Assembly for the uncertainty of conflict. It is to go upward, outward, and into weather. It is to face a creature whose very shape embodies the challenge at hand. Mountain, storm, violence, ambition. The chosen champion must walk willingly into that symbolism and break it. It is no wonder that the search matters. There is something almost judicial about it too. The Assembly is not just scrambling for muscle, it is seeking the proper enforcer of a verdict. Anzu has crossed a line so central that heaven itself now requires correction. The champion is therefore not simply an attacker. He is the agent through which divine order reasserts its right to remain the order. That gives his future battle an official quality. He will go not as a private avenger, but as the arm of the assembly. Mesopotamian myth likes that kind of arrangement. Power is not only force, it is sanctioned force. That distinction separates the warrior god from the rebel beast. Anzu seized authority without right. The champion will use force with right. The contrast is essential. Without it, the story would collapse into a contest between two strong beings. With it, the myth becomes what it truly is, a struggle between usurped power and rightful restoration. The search for the one who can carry that contrast begins to narrow. At this point in the old story world, the logic starts leaning toward a particular kind of god, not the oldest necessarily, nor the most abstractly exalted, nor the most ceremonially central in every possible context. What is needed now is a divine warrior with stature, courage, and proven capacity to confront chaos in active form. A god whose identity is not threatened by battle, but fulfilled by it. A god who can pursue, strike, endure, and return with more than victory. He must return with the tablet, and with the visible proof that heaven has answered the challenge. That already begins to sound like Ninurta. But before the name fully takes the stage, the search itself deserves its due, because it reveals how serious the situation is. The assembly does not instantly settle on the answer, because instant certainty would cheapen the danger. Instead, the myth lets us feel the cost of naming a champion. Whoever is chosen must be enough. More than enough, really. He must confront not only Anzu's body, but the circumstance created by the theft. He must fight through the disruption of order itself. Some traditions even preserve the sense that encouragement is required, that the chosen champion must be strengthened or supported by words, by counsel, by a reminder of what he stands for. This too is deeply human, and therefore deeply mythic. Even great power often needs to hear what is at stake before it moves with full clarity. The gods, despite their rank, are not beyond the language of obligation and honour. In crisis, words still matter. They name the task, they frame the risk, they elevate the mission from mere danger to necessity. That may be one of the quiet beauties of this part of the story. Before the clash, before the arrows, before the storm is met in its own domain, there is this moment where the heavens search not only for strength, but for resolve. The right champion is the one who can turn divine outrage into effective action. The one who can make the assembly's shaken authority solid again through deed. And that means the search is also a test of the gods themselves. Who trusts whom? Who believes the order can still be restored? Who is willing to place the future of that restoration in one champion's hands? Selection is never neutral. It reveals confidence, expectation, and understanding of the threat. By choosing a champion, the assembly defines what sort of answer it believes the crisis requires. If it chooses wisely, heaven stands a chance of reclaiming what was lost. If it chooses poorly, then the theft becomes the beginning of something even worse. There is very little room for error, and all the while Anzu remains in the heights, still in possession of the tablet, still the storm bird who forced the divine centre into response. The longer he holds it, the more pressing the need becomes. Time does not reduce the urgency, it sharpens it. The search cannot go on forever. The assembly must move from consideration to decision. So gradually, the silence of uncertainty begins to take shape around one kind of name. The need for a warrior grows clearer. The need for a restorer rather than a mere avenger becomes unmistakable. The need for a god whose force is disciplined by rightful purpose rises above every other concern. The assembly is not looking for someone who can simply wound Anzu. It is looking for someone who can end the rebellion, retrieve the Tablet of Destinies, and re-establish the truth that sacred order does not belong in the claws of a mountain stormbird. That is a task for a warrior of very particular standing. And in the old Mesopotamian imagination, when the crisis had narrowed to that point, when the assembly had felt the full burden of choosing, when the heavens needed not just anger, but an answer, the search began to turn toward the god whose name would soon carry all of that weight. The room had spent long enough in fear and deliberation. Now it was beginning to look toward the one who could rise from among them, not simply as a fighter, but as the chosen hand of divine restoration. And that is where the focus starts to settle, on Ninurta. By the time the divine assembly's search had narrowed, the shape of the answer was becoming hard to mistake. The gods did not merely need someone brave. They needed someone whose bravery made sense in the structure of the world they were trying to restore. They did not merely need someone powerful. Plenty of divine beings were powerful in one way or another. They needed someone whose power was active, disciplined, and usable against a threat like Anzu. A being of storm, height, cunning, and violent ambition could not be answered by ceremony alone, nor by wisdom spoken at a distance, nor by the quiet confidence of rank. The crisis demanded a warrior, but not just any warrior. It demanded one whose force was legitimate, one whose violence would mean restoration rather than further disruption, one who could go into the high wild places not as a rebel, but as the arm of rightful order. That is where Ninurta begins to rise. And the more one looks at him in the context of Mesopotamian myth, the more inevitable that choice starts to feel. Because Ninurta is not simply a god who happens to be good at fighting. He belongs to a deeper pattern in the old tradition. He is connected with kingship, battle, agriculture, and the maintenance of order. He is not chaos wearing divine jewellery. He is the kind of warrior the structured world depends on when structure is threatened. That is a very important distinction. Anzu represents force that reaches upward without right. Ninurta represents force used in the service of what is right. The conflict between them is therefore more than combat. It is a clash between two ways power can move through the world. That is exactly why the assembly settles on him. It helps to pause and think about how ancient cultures imagine a warrior god in the first place. Modern people often hear warrior god and imagine a kind of endless appetite for battle, all thunderous speeches and weapons raised at every minor inconvenience, as though the divine personality were permanently tuned to maximum aggression. Ancient myths are usually more controlled than that. A warrior god does not exist simply to make conflict louder. He exists because certain threats cannot be answered without force. His function is not random destruction, it is directed strength. When the old order is challenged, when dangerous beings disrupt the structure that allows life and rule to continue, then the warrior god becomes necessary. He is not the opposite of order. He is one of the ways order survives. Ninurta fits that role with unusual precision. He stands within the recognized divine hierarchy. He is no outsider. He does not need to steal legitimacy because he already possesses it through place, function, and acknowledgement. That matters enormously in a story about a usurper. The one chosen to answer Anzu cannot resemble Anzu too closely. If the gods had selected a figure of pure wild rage, the symbolism would collapse into something murkier. But Ninurta is not a stormbird challenger from the margins. He is a god of the centre, even when he moves outward into battle. He can leave the safety of divine order and still carry that order with him. That is exactly what the moment requires. He also has the right kind of reputation. Not merely strong, but proven. Not merely fierce, but usefully fierce. Ancient listeners would not need a long explanation for why a warrior god was being considered. They would understand immediately that this was the domain in which figures like Ninurta mattered most. A crisis involving a monstrous rebel who had stolen cosmic authority was not the sort of thing one handed to a scribe, however gifted, or to a god whose primary association lay elsewhere. This was an enemy to be faced directly, and Ninurta had the kind of identity that could bear that assignment without strain. Still, even if the choice makes sense, the moment of his rising should not be rushed, because in myths like this, the chosen champion does more than receive a task. He becomes the answer to fear. The room that had been tense with panic and uncertainty now begins to gather itself around one figure. All the divine anxiety that had no direction starts to concentrate into purpose. That is a dramatic change. The assembly moves from asking whether anyone can face Anzu to realizing that someone can, and that someone is Ninurta. There is a certain steadiness in that name entering the crisis. The gods are no longer speaking in abstract terms about what must be done. Now they are speaking to the one who will do it. That shift matters. It turns outrage into mission. It turns insult into response. It turns the theft of the Tablet of Destinies from an open wound into a challenge that can perhaps be answered. The atmosphere changes because the possibility of restoration has finally found a body. That body is not casual. Ninurta does not rise as an improvisation. He rises as the kind of power the divine order always hoped it possessed for exactly this sort of emergency. That may be one reason the scene works so well. It suggests that lawful order is not helpless when confronted by rebellion. It may be shaken, yes. It may be exposed and forced into momentary fear. But within it there remains a capacity to answer. Ninurta is that capacity made visible. It is also important that he is not just a fighter in a narrow sense. Across Mesopotamian tradition, figures like Ninurta often gather associations that are broader than battle alone. They can be linked to cultivation, kingship, and the taming of dangerous forces. That wider profile makes him particularly suitable here. He is not merely someone who enjoys combat. He is someone whose combat has meaning. If he defeats Anzu, the victory will not be random triumph. It will restore a damaged world. That makes him the correct champion in a theological sense, not just in a military one. And the old myths cared deeply about theological correctness, even when the action grows dramatic. The chosen god must embody the right answer, not just an effective one. If Anzu stands for rebellion against proper authority, then Ninurta must stand for the union of authority and force. He must show that lawful power does not depend on passivity. It can strike back. It can pursue. It can reclaim what was taken. It can prove that being rightful does not mean being weak. This is one of the reasons warrior gods often become so central in the mythic imagination of early civilizations. Ordered societies need to believe that legitimacy can defend itself, not always directly perhaps, and not without cost, but meaningfully. Otherwise, every usurper becomes a fatal lesson. Anzu's theft has already shown that the centre can be breached. If no one rises from the centre to answer him, then the breach becomes a verdict. Ninurta prevents that. He turns breach into challenge, and challenge into a battle that heaven is willing to wage. One can imagine how the assembly would begin to speak differently once his name settles over the room, not with panic now, but with a kind of focused urgency. The question is no longer who among us might possibly do this. The question is whether Ninurta will take up the burden fully, and that burden is not small. He's being asked to go where divine confidence has already failed once. He's being asked to pursue a creature who has not only insulted the gods, but temporarily displaced the visible basis of their rule. He is being asked to fight under conditions that are themselves unstable, because the Tablet of Destinies remains in Anzu's possession. That means Ninurta is not being offered an ordinary victory. He's being asked to restore the possibility of order at the highest level. There is something almost judicial about this. The warrior god is not chosen for vengeance alone. He's chosen to carry the assembly's judgment into action. Anzu has committed more than theft. He has committed rebellion against the structure of heaven. Ninurta therefore becomes more than a hunter. He becomes the enforcer of divine law. That elevates the coming conflict beyond any simple duel. When Ninurta rises, the assembly rises through him. Their outrage, their rank, their claim to rightful command, all travel with him into the high places. That is what makes him dangerous in exactly the opposite way Anzu is dangerous. Anzu is dangerous because he seized what was not his. Ninurta is dangerous because he does not need to seize legitimacy. He already carries it. His movement toward battle is therefore clean in a symbolic sense. He does not go to become lawful. He goes because he is lawful power in motion. The story needs that contrast. Without it, the battle would become a contest of strength. With it, the battle becomes a contest of claims. Which force actually belongs at the centre of the cosmos? The storm-born challenger who stole decree, or the warrior sent by the divine order to recover it? The answer matters so much that the chosen god must feel equal to it. And Ninurta does. That does not mean the danger disappears. A weaker story would make the champion selection feel like the problem has already been solved. This one is more intelligent than that. Choosing Ninurta is necessary, but it is not yet victory. The assembly is steadier now, yes, because it has found its answer. But the answer still has to be tested. The warrior still has to leave the assembly and enter the enemy's domain. He still has to face a being who is formidable by nature, and further emboldened by possession of the tablet. He still has to meet Storm with force and rebellion with rightful violence. The choice gives hope, but it also concentrates risk. If Ninurta fails, the consequences become even more severe than before. That possibility gives the scene an undercurrent of weight. A champion is uplifting only because he may fall. Ancient myths know this and do not waste it. The chosen warrior's rise is meaningful because it is not free. Once Ninurta accepts the role, he becomes responsible not just for his own combat, but for the restoration of a shaken divine world. That kind of burden changes the feel of a character. He is no longer merely a strong god among others. He becomes, for this moment, the crucial line between heaven reasserting itself and heaven remaining under insult. There may also be, in the old tradition, a note of encouragement or prompting from other divine figures. That too is entirely fitting. Even the right champion sometimes needs to be addressed in terms larger than himself. He must be reminded what is at stake, not because he is ignorant, but because the task is enormous. In human life, responsibility often becomes real only when someone speaks it plainly. Ancient myth understands that, and it often surrounds decisive moments with speech that turns duty into destiny. Ninurta's rise belongs to that sort of moment. The assembly's need presses in. The cosmic stakes are named. The warrior is placed in direct relation to the crisis. He is no longer one god among many. He is the answer the many are depending on. That does something powerful to the story. It gives Ninurta moral height before he ever reaches physical height. He becomes larger not because his weapon grows bigger or his chariot gleams more brightly, though myth is never opposed to a good visual flourish. He becomes larger because obligation has passed into him. He now carries the burden of restoring what Anzu tried to redefine. This is also where the difference between rebellion and sanctioned power becomes especially clear. Anzu rose on ambition. Ninurta rises on responsibility. That distinction may sound subtle, but it is the whole architecture of the myth. Both figures move upward. Both act with force. Both shape events. Yet only one acts with the backing of rightful order. That is why the assembly can trust Ninurta with this mission. He does not seek the centre for himself. He seeks to return the centre to itself. For Mesopotamian listeners, that would have made him exactly the kind of divine warrior they wanted at the heart of the story. A god who could fight is good. A god who fights for the correct restoration of hierarchy, decree and stability is better. The old world did not admire strength in the abstract. It admired strength that held things together, or put them back together after a breach. Ninurta embodies that kind of strength, and because he does, the emotional rhythm of the story begins to shift. Fear is still present, but it is now joined by expectation. The room that had been held in uncertainty can begin to look outward again. The assembly is no longer only reacting to Anzu's boldness. It is preparing to answer it. There is tremendous relief in that, even if the danger remains. The existence of a champion means the divine order has not exhausted itself in panic. it still possesses a hand willing to act. One can almost feel the movement from chamber to threshold. Until now, the story has been turned inward, toward the assembly, toward shock, deliberation, and selection. With Ninurta rising, the story begins to turn outward again. The centre has found its emissary. The order that was wounded has gathered itself into a warrior. Soon that warrior will have to leave safety behind and enter the storm. But before he does, it is worth understanding how much of the divine world is now resting on him. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. The tablet must be reclaimed. Anzu must be answered. The insult to heaven must be reversed. The possibility that rebellion can seize legitimacy and hold it must be broken. Ninurta now stands at the point where all of those needs converge. That makes him more than a hero in the simple sense. He is the chosen form of restoration. When he rises as the divine order's willingness to risk force in defense of itself. That is one reason the scene should feel grave as well as inspiring. The assembly is not cheering at a tournament. It is entrusting a warrior with the repair of a cosmic wound. The god who goes forth must succeed not only for himself, but for the logic of the world the gods inhabit. If Anzu can take the Tablet of Destinies and remain unchallenged, then heaven's authority becomes a memory. If Ninurta can meet him, strike him down, and recover what was stolen, then heaven proves that even a shaken order can still answer from its own strength. In that sense, Ninurta rises not merely because he is able, but because the story requires a figure through whom authority can become action, without ceasing to be authority. That is a rare role. Many beings can fight. Few can fight and still represent the centre. Fewer still can step into chaos without becoming chaotic themselves. Ninurta is chosen because he can do exactly that. He can go where Anzu rules by wild height and still remain the warrior of the assembly, the god who does not lose himself in the storm but carries the assembly's purpose straight through it. And that makes the coming pursuit feel almost inevitable now. Once he has risen, the tension changes kind. The question is no longer whether heaven has an answer. The question is what that answer will look like when it reaches the mountains. What force will meet Anzu in his own domain? What words, weapons, and resolve will Ninurta bring against the winged rebel who dared to take the centre of order for himself? The champion has been found. The divine burden has settled on the proper shoulders, and the stillness before action is beginning to thin, because the next step is no longer selection but movement. And once Ninurta turns toward the wild heights with the assembly's authority behind him, the story is ready to follow him into the place where storm and judgment are finally going to meet. By the time Ninurta left the assembly, the problem had become wonderfully simple, in the way only terrible problems sometimes do. The Tablet of Destinies was in the wrong claws. The Stormbird had carried sacred authority into the high wild places. Heaven had chosen its answer. Now that answer had to travel upward into weather and stone and settle the matter directly. There was no argument left to make, no further committee work likely to improve the situation, no chance that Anzu would wake up in a more reasonable mood and return the governing structure of the cosmos with a short note of apology. The thing had gone beyond discussion. It had become a hunt, and hunts in myth are rarely quiet, especially when the quarry is a mountain storm creature holding the basis of divine rule. Still, it helps to picture the setting before the clash begins. Anzu is not waiting in some clean open field where everyone can admire the choreography. He's in the heights, in the rough spaces that already belonged to him long before he stole the tablet. That matters because creatures fight differently in the places that formed them. A fish is dangerous in water for reasons that go beyond teeth. A lion is dangerous in tall grass for reasons that go beyond claws. And Anzu, being a storm bird of mountains and upper air, is dangerous in the wild heights for reasons that go beyond size. The terrain itself leans toward him. The ridges, the winds, the sudden drop-offs, the broken visibility, the cloud cover, the roar of air moving around stone, all of it turns the battlefield into an extension of his body. That is the first problem Ninurta faces. He is not only going to battle Anzu, he's going to battle Anzu inside Anzu's own kind of world. This gives the coming fight a very different feeling from a courtly duel, or a heroic contest arranged under orderly conditions. This is not controlled. This is not symmetrical. The chosen warrior of heaven is moving out of structure and into a zone where structure is thin. He is climbing, advancing, or otherwise entering the space where the rebel is strongest, carrying with him the authority of the divine assembly and the expectation that he can somehow force that authority to matter in a place defined by distance from the centre. That is one reason the story works so well. Restoration does not happen from the safety of the throne. It has to go out and find the thing that broke the world. One can imagine the mountains under darkening sky, not because the text always pauses to give us a scenic tour, but because the logic of the myth demands an environment equal to the scale of the crisis. These are not friendly hills. These are sharp, elevated places where weather forms fast and sound carries strangely. The air is colder. The ground is uneven. Sight lines appear and vanish. Clouds press low enough to feel like part of the landscape. And somewhere in that unstable upper world is Anzu, the great hybrid bird who stole the Tablet of Destinies, and with it the confidence of heaven itself. He would not appear small. That is another important detail. If Ninurta has been chosen as the divine answer, then Anzu must feel worthy of that answer. The Stormbird cannot suddenly become manageable now that the hero has arrived. He has to remain formidable, not just because the plot requires tension, but because the symbolism requires it. The rebel must fully embody the dangerous possibility the assembly feared. He must look like a being who could have done what he did. A giant winged creature in the heights, charged with storm power, already amplified by possession of the tablet, fits that role perfectly. So when the battle begins to take shape, it is not merely a scene of two strong beings approaching each other. It is a collision between two kinds of force. On one side is wild power that sees legitimacy without right. On the other is lawful power sent to recover legitimacy by force. The difference is essential. If one misses that, the fight becomes spectacle. If one understands it, the fight becomes the hinge of the entire myth. Ninurta does not come as a private avenger. He comes as the chosen arm of the assembly. Anzu does not stand as a misunderstood local bird being unfairly persecuted by central administration. He stands as the rebel who took the one thing he was never supposed to touch. This is not a misunderstanding in the mountains. It is a cosmic correction in progress. And because Mesopotamian stories know the value of tension, the fight is not simply a clean rush of action. There is pressure in the approach. The warrior advances into a place where nature itself seems to take Anzu's side. Wind matters here. Altitude matters. The sky itself becomes part of the problem. A creature of the upper air can move with the storm, use cloud and height, strike from above, vanish for a moment, then return with force. That means Ninurta is fighting not a grounded enemy, but an enemy who uses vertical distance as an advantage. Modern people sometimes underestimate how frightening that must have felt in ancient imagination. Predators on the ground are bad enough. Predators above are worse because they break ordinary expectations of safety. Human beings can wall cities, close gates, and watch roads. The sky is another matter. Something that descends from above is difficult to plan against. A stormbird carrying rebellion with it would feel like danger arriving from the one direction civilization cannot fence. That is exactly the atmosphere the story needs. And so the clash in the wild heights becomes a battle of movement as much as impact. Anzu is not merely a target. He is a mobile force cutting through wind and elevation, carrying with him all the panic he created below. Ninurta, by contrast, has to bring steadiness into that motion. He has to remain purpose inside turbulence. That is one reason arrows become so fitting in this mythic context. To answer a sky creature, a warrior needs reach. He needs more than courage. He needs a way to strike into the air, to cut through distance, to impose directed force on a being who relies on altitude and velocity. Arrows do exactly that. They are the right weapon for this kind of story, not only practically, but symbolically. An arrow is intent given line. It is decision made flight. It crosses the gap between order and disruption. A sword is intimate. A spear is forceful. But an arrow, especially in a battle against a stormbird above the earth, feels correct. It rises into the very space the rebel thinks he controls. It says that the divine answer is not confined to the ground. Still, an arrow alone does not win the fight. Anzu is too great for that to be easy. He is a creature of storm, and storms do not politely hold still while one aims. The weather itself may seem to move with him. One can picture the air around his wings buffeting the battlefield, the rush of movement and noise making aim difficult, the sheer scale of the creature turning each pass into a test of nerve. The mountain setting magnifies all of this. Echoes distort sound, clouds cut visibility, stone reflects impact. Nothing is still. That is important, because the battle must feel like more than a technical exchange of attacks. It must feel unstable. Ninurta is entering the crisis in its full form. To bring order back, he has to pass through disorder, not around it. Ancient stories often understand this very well. The hero does not restore the world by staying clean. He restores it by stepping into the place where the world is torn open and forcing that place closed. Ninurta's struggle with Anzu is exactly that kind of action. The wound in heaven has taken shape in a mountain storm. The warrior god now has to answer it where it lives. There is also the matter of the Tablet of Destinies itself. So long as Anzu holds it, the battle is not merely dangerous in the ordinary sense. It is dangerous in a distorted sense. The stolen object deepens the threat. It gives the rebel not just confidence, but a terrifying kind of temporary elevation. Even if Anzu does not become a fully rightful ruler by theft, the possession still matters. It still affects the situation. The gods would not have panicked otherwise. So when Ninurta faces him, he faces a being who has wrapped himself, however illegitimately, in the visible sign of cosmic authority. That makes the clash feel heavier than a simple monster hunt. The warrior is not just trying to kill a beast. He's trying to pry sacred order out of the grip of a usurper who has brought that order into direct contact with violence. There may even be, in some versions and scholarly reconstructions of the tradition, a moment of difficulty where the battle does not go cleanly at first, where the champion needs support, counsel, or divine instruction to overcome the rebel properly. That kind of detail fits the logic of the myth beautifully. It reminds us that even the chosen warrior cannot rely on straightforward strength alone. A crisis of this scale demands more than force. It demands the right use of force. That is an old lesson in myth and in politics. Hitting the problem is not always the same as solving it. Ninurta therefore becomes a particularly interesting kind of combatant. He's brave, yes, and strong, yes, but he is also the bearer of a necessary correction. His violence has to be aligned with restoration. That means the fight is not simply about overpowering Anzu in the most dramatic way possible, though the story would certainly not object to drama. It is about breaking the rebel's hold on the tablet and ending the false center he has tried to create, and that takes persistence. One can imagine the first exchanges failing to settle the matter. Anzu wheels in the sky, great wings beating storm into the air, perhaps striking, retreating, using his height, his mobility, and the sheer force of his presence to keep the warrior under pressure. Ninurta must hold his ground, or whatever counts as ground in a battle partly fought above ridges and under moving cloud. He must read the rhythm of the creature. He must wait for a moment when aim and purpose coincide. That, too, is part of the symbolic meaning. Lawful force is often less impulsive than a rebellious force. It endures. It seeks the proper opening. It does not need to thrash if it can strike true. There is something deeply satisfying about that contrast. Anzu is broad violence with ambition. Ninurta is disciplined violence with sanction. both are mighty, but only one can afford patience. And when the moment comes, it has to feel earned. The arrow, or the decisive strike in whatever form the tradition gives it, matters because it interrupts Anzu's claim not just physically, but mythically. It breaks the illusion that seizing legitimacy is the same as holding it securely. That is a very important difference. Many rebels can take, fewer can keep. The battle in the wild heights becomes the proof of that principle. Once Ninurta lands the true blow, the whole logic of the story begins to turn. The storm bird who shook heaven is no longer pure upward force. He is vulnerable. He can bleed, fall, falter, lose grip. And that is precisely what the assembly needed proven. Anzu had made the centre look fragile. Ninurta must now make the usurper look mortal. In mythic terms, that is often the turning point no less than the injury itself. The rebel ceases to be the one dictating the crisis and becomes the object of judgment. The air changes. The pursuit becomes execution of the divine answer. The storm is still there, but it no longer belongs entirely to Anzu. The mountains would seem different at that moment. The same heights that amplified his threat now become the stage of his defeat. That reversal is one of the pleasures of stories like this. Place itself changes meaning as the balance of power shifts. The upper world that had sheltered rebellion now witnesses its collapse. The air that had carried the usurper now carries the force that brings him down. And when Anzu falls, or is struck low enough that his hold is broken, the importance of that fall cannot be overstated. It is not merely the defeat of an enemy, it is the end of a false arrangement. The thing stolen from the centre begins to return to the logic of the centre. That is why the battle matters so much. No speech in the assembly could have done this. No ritual of outrage could have done this. The correction had to be enacted in the same physical and symbolic space where the rebellion had established itself. Storm met answer in the heights. Illegitimate force met rightful force. Flight met aim, seizure met recovery. That is the structure beneath all the noise and violence. There is also something very old in the image of a great bird struck from the sky. Human beings have always responded to that kind of reversal with a particular intensity. What is above us feels powerful partly because it is above us. To bring it down is to restore a kind of moral geometry. The high thing that overreached returns to earth. In Anzu's case, that geometry is perfect. He rose into the sphere of lawful authority without right. Ninurta's victory returns him from false elevation. And yet even here the story is not truly about humiliation for its own sake. It is about restoration. That is what separates divine correction from petty revenge. Anzu must fall because the Tablet of Destinies must be reclaimed. The rebel must be broken because the sacred order he interrupted must be made whole again. The battle is dramatic, but it is not empty violence. It is purposeful. That purpose gives even the image of arrows and storm a calm centre beneath the action. The listener is not meant to get lost in chaos. The listener is meant to feel chaos being answered. The mountains are loud. The wind is harsh. The winged rebel is immense. But through all of that, the story keeps its line. Ninurta came to end this. Every movement in the battle bends toward that fact. That is why the climax does not feel random when it arrives. The decisive strike is not luck. It is the moment where lawful intent finally overcomes unlawful seizure. It says, in the language of myth, that the world may be shaken but not surrendered, that the centre may be breached but not erased, that a storm bird may carry destiny away for a time, but time is not the same as triumph, and perhaps that is the deepest satisfaction in the whole scene. The battle above the earth is not just entertaining or impressive, it resolves a question the story has been asking since the theft. Can the old order actually answer the force that challenged it? Ninurta's clash with Anzu says yes, but not easily, not cheaply, and not from a safe distance. Order answers by climbing into danger and striking true there. By the end of the fight, the mountains are no longer simply the rebels' refuge. They have become the place where rebellion was measured and found breakable. The air no longer belongs only to Anzu's violence. it has been crossed by the Assembly's chosen response, and the Tablet of Destinies, so long the focus of fear, is no longer securely fused to the Stormbird's rebellion. It is within reach of return. That return matters as much as the victory itself, because defeating Anzu without recovering the tablet would only solve half the problem. The rebel must fall, yes, but the sacred object must also be restored. The visible basis of cosmic authority must leave the wild heights and go back to the place where it belongs. Only then can the battle truly count as more than revenge. Only then can heaven move from wounded outrage back toward functioning order. So as the storm begins to break around the site of the clash, as the great bird's challenge collapses under the force sent against him, the story starts turning from violence to recovery. Ninurta has done what the Assembly asked of him. He has met the winged rebel in his own domain and proved that divine legitimacy can fight, pursue, and win. The air is not fully calm yet, and the world is not instantly repaired, but the main fact has changed. The false centre has been broken. The usurper's hold has failed. And in the quiet that comes after such a struggle, the next question is no longer whether Anzu can be stopped. It is what the restoration of the tablet will mean now that the Stormbird has finally been answered. When Anzu fell, the battle itself was not the whole victory. That is the first thing worth settling into, because stories like this can be easy to remember as dramatic motion and easy to forget as systems. A great Stormbird steals the Tablet of Destinies. The gods panic. A warrior rises. Arrows fly in the heights. The rebel is struck down. And that sounds like a complete myth already. It sounds satisfying enough to stand on its own. But in the old Mesopotamian imagination, defeating the rebel was only half the task. The deeper problem had never been merely that Anzu was alive and dangerous. The deeper problem was that he had seized the visible basis of rightful authority and pulled it out of its proper place. So after the fall, what mattered most was not only that the challenger had been answered, it was that the order he interrupted could now begin to return. That is what Anzu's defeat restored to the world. Not silence exactly. Ancient myths rarely promise silence for very long. Not a sentimental peace either, as though the gods all learned something gentle, shared a meaningful look, and agreed to communicate better in future. Mesopotamian myth is generally more realistic than that about power. What Anzu's defeat restored was structure. It restored the connection between authority and rightful possession. It restored the confidence that the centre of the cosmos still belonged at the centre. It restored the idea that the heavens were not merely old and impressive, but still able to defend the order they claim to govern. That may sound almost administrative, but in the world of this story, administrative things are sacred things. Records matter, decrees matter, offices matter, custody matters, the right object in the right hands matters. Ancient Mesopotamia understood very clearly that a society is not held together only by force, and not even mainly by force. It is held together by recognized force, by accepted command, by signs that the chain of order still exists and still works. The same logic is lifted into myth here. The Tablet of Destinies does not return to its rightful place merely because it is a powerful object, and powerful objects ought to be tidied away after use. It returns because the world itself depends on the visible restoration of legitimacy. That is why the aftermath has such weight. Imagine the difference in the divine realm once Ninurta has prevailed. Before the battle, heaven was reacting. The assembly had been forced into uncertainty. Panic spread because the gods were no longer fully sure where authority stood. Even if every divine being knew in principle that Anzu was no rightful ruler, that did not erase the problem that he held the thing that marked and carried rule. The old order therefore stood in a kind of strange suspension. It had not ceased to exist, but it had been exposed, interrupted and insulted. That is a difficult state for any hierarchy to endure. The longer it continues, the more corrosive it becomes. After the fall, that corrosive uncertainty begins to lift. The lifting matters because it changes the emotional weather of the story as much as the cosmic one. A rebellion can wound by making the structure look weak. A restoration heals by proving the structure can still answer. Once Anzu is defeated and the tablet is recovered, the heavens no longer stand as a centre that was breached and left standing in humiliation. They stand as a centre that was breached and then reasserted itself. That distinction is everything. It turns injury into memory instead of verdict. It means the old order has not simply survived in theory, it has survived in action. Ancient listeners would have understood the importance of that immediately. No king wants to be thought of as the ruler who was robbed and never answered it. No temple wants to be known as the place where sacred custody failed and remained failed. No divine assembly wants to become the heavenly version of a court that lost its seal to a mountain bird and then held several very serious meetings about the matter while doing nothing. Action changes the meaning of the breach. And because Ninurta has acted successfully, the assembly can now receive back not just a tablet, but its own dignity. This is one of the most important things Anzu's defeat restores: divine dignity. That may sound like a matter of pride, and pride is certainly involved, but it is not only pride. In hierarchical worlds, dignity is part of authority. The ruler who appears unable to protect the bases of rule does not only feel embarrassed, the ruler becomes vulnerable in the eyes of everyone below. Mesopotamian political life understood this. A king's status mattered. A god's status mattered. Ceremonial confidence mattered because it helped make order believable. So when Anzu steals the Tablet of Destinies, he damages not only practical control but divine prestige. His defeat therefore repairs prestige too. It says that the assembly was shaken but not broken. It says that the insult was real but not permanent. It says that the gods did not merely complain. They responded. There is something deeply satisfying in that old logic. The story does not pretend a wound never happened. It simply refuses to let the wound become the final truth. And that refusal has consequences far beyond the divine court itself. The tablet governs heaven and earth because the order of heaven is the foundation for the order of earth. That is how the myth thinks. The world below is not separate from the divine hierarchy above. Human kingship, temple order, agricultural continuity, ritual timing, and the larger predictability of life all depend, in one way or another, on the heavens remaining rightly governed. So when the Tablet of Destinies returns to proper custody, Earth is restored as well, even if no village sees the event directly, and no scribe in a city office looks up and says, "Good, I had been concerned the constitutional bird problem was still ongoing." The restoration reaches downward because legitimacy reaches downward. That means Anzu's defeat restores more than divine morale. It restores the pattern by which reality is supposed to hold together. The old channels of command can function cleanly again. The rights of decree return to the correct source. Fate is no longer even temporarily attached to a rebel gripping what he should never have held. The world can be imagined as stable again, not because danger has vanished forever, but because danger has been answered and placed back beneath lawful order. This is the sort of thing myths care about very deeply. Victory is not important only because the hero survives or the villain falls. Victory is important because it re-establishes the shape in which life can continue. In stories rooted in early civilizations, that continuation matters immensely. Ancient people did not have the luxury of treating order as an abstract preference. Order meant irrigation maintained, offerings made, land worked, calendars observed, authority recognized, and tomorrow still possible. So when a divine myth speaks of restoring heaven, it is also speaking, by extension, of restoring the possibility of ordinary life below. That gives the aftermath a quiet seriousness. It is not just celebration, it is repair, and repair is usually a more meaningful kind of triumph than simple conquest. One of the gentler truths in old myth is that restoration is often harder than destruction. Destruction can happen in a moment. A theft, a betrayal, a storm, a rash decision, a broken boundary, and suddenly everything is unstable. Restoration requires movement in the opposite direction. It requires the right thing to be put back in the right place by the right hand. It requires force to stop being merely force and become correction. In Anzu's story, that is exactly what happens. Ninurta does not just win a battle. He helps reassemble the relationship between authority and order. That is why the story lingers in memory better than a simple monster fight would. The return of the tablet matters because it is the return of rightful arrangement itself. There is also another layer to what Anzu's defeat restores, and it has to do with confidence in the structure of the gods. Before the theft, heaven may have appeared unshakable. During the crisis, that appearance was badly damaged. After the defeat, the old confidence returns, but it does not return unchanged. This is important. A breach answered is not the same as a breach never suffered. The gods now know, and the story now knows, that the centre can be challenged. That knowledge does not vanish when the tablet is recovered. It remains in the background like a scar, not always visible, but always part of what happened. That makes the restoration more mature than a simple reset. Ancient myths often have this quality. They restore order, but the memory of disorder remains folded inside the restored world. The flood ends, but the memory of flood survives. The rebellion is crushed, but the possibility of rebellion has been revealed. The monster is slain, but the story still remembers what sort of world can produce monsters. Anzu's defeat therefore restores the world in a way that is stronger, but perhaps also a little less innocent. The gods can hold the centre again, yet they now know that the centre is not immune to challenge. That is not a flaw in the story. It is one of its strengths. Because restored order that has survived a test feels weightier than order that was never tested at all. This is also why Ninurta's role matters so much in the aftermath. He restores not only the tablet, but trust in the divine assembly's ability to answer crisis. Before he rose, the assembly had fear, outrage, and the knowledge that something must be done. After he returns successful, that uncertainty has been transformed into proof. The gods now know that they still possess, within their own order, the power to pursue rebellion into difficult places and reclaim what was stolen. That knowledge strengthens the centre in a way that speeches alone never could. It also increases Ninurta's stature, of course. The chosen champion who restores destiny to its rightful holder becomes more than just a useful warrior. He becomes the one through whom the gods learned that their order could survive exposure. That is a significant kind of prestige. Ancient audiences loved such figures not merely because they were strong, but because their strength preserved the conditions in which divine and human life made sense. Ninurta's victory is therefore not private glory. It is public stability. He has become the form of successful restoration. At the same time, Anzu's defeat restores a certain boundary between centre and margin. This is easy to miss, but it's one of the most interesting parts of the myth. Anzu is associated with mountain, storm, upper wildness, and dangerous distance from orderly city life. When he steals the Tablet of Destinies, the margin invades the centre. The high wild places seize the instrument of lawful decree. That collapse of boundary is one reason the crisis is so severe. Categories are no longer staying in their place. The creature of the margins has carried the centre into the wild. After the fall, that border is reasserted. The sacred thing returns from mountain storm to divine custody. The centre stops being displaced. The margin stops pretending to rule. In symbolic terms, the world becomes itself again. The wild still exists, of course. Mountains do not disappear because one stormbird is defeated. Weather remains dangerous. Distant places remain difficult, but they no longer hold the visible basis of cosmic order. Their challenge has been driven back out of the throne room of meaning. That is another way of saying the world has become legible again. And legibility matters in old cultures. People can live with danger more easily than they can live with confusion about where danger belongs. A flood belongs to water. A lion belongs to the hunt. A mountain storm belongs to the heights. A sacred tablet belongs to the ruler of destinies. When those placements are broken, fear deepens because the world stops behaving according to its own logic. Anzu's defeat restores logic to placement. It says that things may still be dangerous, but they will once again be dangerous in the way the cosmos understands. There is almost a comfort in that. Not modern comfort, perhaps, but the older comfort of a world whose categories hold. Another thing restored by Anzu's defeat is the idea that force and right are not permanently separable. During the theft, Anzu appears to have achieved exactly that separation. He has force, and he has taken the sign of right. That creates a temporary nightmare in which illegitimate strength can carry lawful authority away, and perhaps even make it serve him. The defeat breaks that nightmare. It reunites force with rightful purpose. In Ninurta, power is again aligned with legitimacy. In the tablet's return, authority is again aligned with proper possession. The story, in other words, refuses to let the universe remain in the hands of mere seizure. This is a very ancient political hope. And it is not always borne out in human history, which may be one reason myths insist on it so strongly. Human societies often see strength and right come apart. Usurpers rise, tyrants hold power, sacred things fall into unworthy hands. Myths answer that painful knowledge not by denying it, but by staging a world in which such separation cannot stand forever. Anzu can steal destiny. Yes, he cannot keep it. That is the reassurance hidden inside the drama. Not that evil never succeeds, but that success by theft is unstable at the deepest level. For listeners, that would have mattered. It would also have mattered that the restoration is not automatic. The gods do not simply wait and watch destiny float back into place because the universe prefers proper filing. Ninurta has to act. The assembly has to choose. The rebel has to be confronted where he is strongest. That makes restoration meaningful. It is won, not assumed. And because it is won, it proves the value of the order being restored. The world is worth the danger required to reclaim it. That is a profound statement beneath a story about a giant divine bird. There is something else Anzu's defeat restores as well, and that is measure. Rebellion in myths often involves excess. Someone reaches too far, holds too much, takes what does not belong to them, claims more than their nature should bear. Anzu does exactly that. He overreaches into the seat of destinies. His fall is therefore not only punishment, but remeasurement. He is brought back into proportion. He may have been mighty, but he is not mightier than rightful order in the long run. He may have touched the centre, but he cannot become the centre by theft. The return of measure is often one of the quietest forms of justice in myth. It does not always look dramatic after the battle is over, but it is there. The cosmos is no longer distorted around a false holder. The weight of things settles again where it belongs. The old hierarchy, however imperfect or severe, regains its balance. This does not mean Anzu becomes meaningless after his defeat. Quite the opposite. The fact that the world had to be restored at all means his challenge revealed something true. He showed that sacred order can be tested. He showed that the margins are not empty. He showed that storm, ambition, and power can converge into a real threat to the centre. The restoration does not erase that revelation. It simply ensures that the revelation does not become rule. And because it does not become rule, the story can now begin to shift from action to interpretation. Once the immediate danger is over, people start asking what the danger meant. Once the tablet is back where it belongs, the mind has room to dwell on the creature who dared to take it. Once the heavens are stable again, Anzu becomes available not only as a defeated enemy, but as a figure to think about. That movement is already beginning in the aftermath. Still, before we get there, it is worth resting a little longer in what has been repaired. Heaven has its centre back. Earth has its alignment back. The assembly has its dignity back. The chain between rightful decree and actual force has been rejoined. The boundary between lawful order and wild usurpation has been clarified. The gods can once again appear as what they claim to be, the recognized governors of the cosmos, not merely a group of divine beings who are briefly outmaneuvered by an especially ambitious weather creature. That restored appearance matters because appearance in these stories is not separate from reality. Legitimacy must be visible. The tablet must be seen in proper custody. The rebel must be seen defeated. The champion must be seen successful. Myth understands something that states and temples also understand. People trust order more deeply when order has a visible centre. So the aftermath is not complete until everything looks right again. The old world, in that sense, needs ceremony, even when the story does not describe every formal detail. The return of the tablet is itself ceremonial in meaning. It is the world reseated. The cosmic chair has not just been defended, it has been occupied properly again. And that is why Anzu's defeat restores the possibility of continuity. The gods may still contend, storms may still gather, human beings may still worry over crops, omens, kings, and the price of survival, but the basic architecture of things is no longer in rebel claws. The centre holds once more. That is not a small achievement. It is the largest kind. Yet the story is too intelligent to leave the matter there as though victory closed the subject. Anzu has fallen, but he has also entered memory more deeply by falling. Defeated rebels often become more interesting, not less, because once they are no longer immediate threats, they can be examined. People begin to wonder what they embodied. Were they merely monsters? Were they cautionary symbols? Were they expressions of fears too large for simpler forms? Were they reminders of forces civilization can never fully tame? The same is true here. Anzu's defeat restores the world, but it also leaves behind a figure who now invites interpretation, and that is where the story begins to turn next. Once the battle is over and the tablet is secure again, once heaven has taken back its own reflection, the mind is free to look more carefully at the Stormbird himself, not just as an enemy who had to be struck down, but as a figure Mesopotamian culture kept remembering for a reason. His fall repaired the cosmos, but it did not erase the meanings that made him dangerous in the first place, and once order is safely restored, those meanings become the next thing worth following. Once Anzu has been defeated and the Tablet of Destinies returned to its rightful place, the story changes shape in a very interesting way. The urgent part is over. The heavens are no longer in immediate panic. The rebel has been answered. The wild heights no longer hold the centre of cosmic authority in their claws, and because of that, the mind is finally free to ask a different kind of question. Not what must be done, but what all of this meant. Not how the Stormbird was stopped, but why a Stormbird like Anzu had to exist in Mesopotamian imagination at all. That is where he becomes even more interesting. Because it is easy, at first glance, to call Anzu a monster and leave it there. He's certainly monstrous enough by any ordinary standard. He's hybrid, immense, violent, elevated, disruptive, and strongly associated with the kind of weather that does not usually improve anyone's day. He steals the most sacred object of authority, throws the divine realm into crisis, and forces the gods to send a chosen warrior into the mountains to bring him down. On paper, that is excellent monster behaviour. He is not subtle about causing problems. An ancient myth, like every mythology worth remembering, has no shortage of dangerous beings whose purpose is mainly to threaten order, so that order can prove itself by surviving them. But Anzu does not feel like a simple monster for very long. Simple monsters tend to remain on one level. They devour, attack, lurk, poison, block the way, or embody fear in a more or less direct form. They may be memorable, certainly, but their function stays clear. Anzu is different because he is not merely hostile, he is aspirational. He does not just damage the divine order, he reaches for its centre. He understands, or is imagined as understanding, what authority is and where it sits. He is not content to haunt the margins as an atmospheric problem with feathers. He wants the thing that makes rule possible. That is not just monstrosity. That is rebellion, and rebellion changes everything. Once a figure in myth becomes a rebel, he enters a more complicated category. He stops being only the creature that must be slain, and becomes the creature that reveals something uncomfortable about the world he challenges. A pure monster can be externalized. It comes from outside, it threatens, it is removed, and everyone returns to normal with renewed appreciation for city walls and proper rituals. A rebel is harder to dismiss. A rebel has motive. A rebel exposes tension in the structure itself. A rebel asks whether the centre is as secure, as rightful, or as untouchable as it claims to be. Even if the rebel is condemned, and Anzu certainly is, he still drags those questions into the light simply by acting. That may be one reason Mesopotamian tradition preserved him so well. Anzu is not just dangerous, he is useful to thought. He allows the culture to stage one of its deepest concerns. What happens when power and legitimacy come apart? That concern would have mattered intensely in Mesopotamia. This was a world of kingship, temple power, divine sanction, inherited office, decrees, legal arrangements, and constant negotiation between force and right. Cities rose and fell. Dynasties claimed the favour of the gods. Conquest happened. Internal struggle happened. Sacred authority was never just an abstract heavenly issue. It was woven into daily life and public ideology. The question of who had the right to rule was always larger than the question of who could physically seize control for a while. So a myth in which a stormbird steals the basis of cosmic authority is not only fantasy, it is a dramatized version of a very real cultural anxiety. What if the wrong being gets the signs of rightful rule? That question does not need to be modernized to feel familiar. It is already fully alive in the ancient context. Mesopotamia knew the difference between lawful kingship and raw violence. It knew that power often tries to wear legitimacy, whether or not it deserves it. It knew that sacred symbols matter because people organize their lives around them. Anzu therefore becomes more than a creature. He becomes the possibility that force might seize the appearance of right and, for a time, make the entire order tremble. That makes him a rebel in the deepest sense. But even that may not exhaust what he meant. Because there is also the matter of nature, an especially wild nature in Mesopotamian thought. Anzu is a storm bird of the mountains, a being associated with weather, height, distance, and the rough edges of the world beyond the managed life of cities and fields. That already gives him symbolic power beyond politics. He can be read as the intrusion of untamed natural force into the carefully arranged structure of civilization. Mesopotamia, perhaps more than some later cultures, knew how fragile civilization could be. Cities existed by constant effort. Water had to be managed. Labour had to be organised. Ritual and administration had to continue. The line between order and disorder was not imaginary, it was daily work. Against that backdrop, Anzu starts to look like a mythic expression of the fear that what is outside control may not remain outside control forever. The mountains matter here. So do the storms. The southern Mesopotamian city world was built in river plains, in a landscape that could be cultivated, measured, divided, taxed, irrigated, and richly integrated. Mountains represented something else. Distance, foreignness, resources certainly, but also unpredictability. They were not the everyday setting of ordered urban life. They were where the shape of the world grew rougher and less obedient. A storm bird emerging from or linked to those heights is therefore not just a cool visual choice by some ancient poet with a taste for dramatic entrances. He is the wild world becoming personal enough to challenge the centre. That makes him something more than a rebel against the gods. He is also rebellion by the environment itself, or at least by the parts of the environment least assimilated into urban order. and ancient people would have felt that with unusual sharpness. They did not live at a comfortable symbolic distance from weather, flood, drought, heat, wind, and landscape. The natural world was not background. It was a partner, threat, limit, and judge. When the world beyond the city was imagined as a winged power capable of seizing authority, the myth was not just saying, "Beware, monsters." It was saying something like, "Remember that the forces beyond management are not gone simply because you built a temple." That is an old and serious thought. It may also help explain why Anzu is not portrayed as merely stupid violence. Natural force in Mesopotamian thought was not always blind. Storms might feel purposeful. Omens mattered. Weather could be read as communication. The line between nature and divine will was not as hard as modern habits often make it. So a storm being that acts with intelligence is not strange in this world. It is exactly the kind of thing such a worldview would produce. Anzu becomes a personalized version of dangerous force, the kind of force that not only strikes but chooses. Once he chooses, of course, he becomes even more politically charged. That is why monster and rebel are both true, but neither seems enough. There is another layer here having to do with proximity to divine order itself. Anzu is not wholly outside the system in the way a random wilderness threat might be. He is near enough to sacred authority to identify its heart. He knows what matters. He knows what to take. That suggests a deeper unease than simple outside danger. It suggests that the order of the gods may contain within or near itself the possibility of breach. This is where Anzu becomes truly unsettling. A monster from outside can be fought and forgotten. A figure who reveals internal vulnerability is harder to leave behind. He shows that the centre has weak points. He shows that sacred custody can fail. He shows that the most important object in the cosmos can be touched by something that does not belong in the hierarchy. That revelation lingers even after the rebel is defeated. It becomes part of what the myth now knows about itself. In that sense, Anzu may have meant danger from the edge, but also danger through access. The structure is threatened not only because the margins are strong, but because the margins have come close enough to study the centre. That is a very sophisticated anxiety for an ancient myth to carry, though perhaps not surprising in a civilization so invested in administration and hierarchy. Systems fear invasion, yes, but they fear infiltration and seizure even more. The outsider who can strike the heart of rule is always more disturbing than the outsider who merely batters the walls. Anzu is that kind of figure. He's not only weather against civilization, he is the outsider who learns where legitimacy lives. And once that is true, he becomes available as a symbol of ambition itself. That word matters here. Ambition is not always treated kindly in old myths, especially when it aims upward in the wrong way. There is often a strong suspicion of beings who reach beyond their place. Humans experience this too. Ancient literature is full of warnings about excess, overreach, pride, and the dangerous desire to become what one is not sanctioned to become. Anzu fits that pattern beautifully. He's not content with being powerful in his own domain. He wants more. He wants what confers rule. He wants what belongs to the centre. He wants what gives shape to destiny. That is classic overreach. And yet myths do not preserve overreach so carefully unless they are also fascinated by it. Condemnation and fascination often live side by side in stories like this. Everyone knows Anzu must be stopped, but everyone also remembers that he dared to do the thing others did not dare. He crossed the line. He put his claws on the source of authority itself. That is horrifying, but it is also memorable in a way simple obedience never is. This may be why figures like Anzu survive so well in cultural memory. They dramatize a forbidden possibility. They show the imagination taking one step beyond what order permits, and asking what would happen if that step were real. For Mesopotamia, that question may have had both religious and political force. Could kingship be challenged? Could rule be seized? Could sacred authority be disrupted? Could the dangerous energies beyond the settled world rise high enough to threaten the very principle by which the settled world remains settled? Anzu puts all of that into one winged body. He may also have meant something about divine kingship itself. Ancient Near Eastern cultures often imagine kingship as a thing that descends, is granted, sanctioned, or held properly rather than simply grabbed and justified afterward. That does not mean people never grabbed it in reality, of course. They did. But ideology mattered. Kings liked to claim that rule came through divine right, inheritance, proper favour, lawful succession, and cosmic approval. In that context, a myth where the basis of destiny is stolen tells listeners exactly what illegitimate power looks like in its purest form. It looks like seizure without sanction. It looks like possession without right. It looks like Anzu. That would make the story politically useful in a broad sense. It does not have to map onto one specific historical event to express a durable principle. The true ruler is not the one who merely takes, but the one who holds authority rightly. The usurper may terrify for a while. He may even possess the sacred signs. But if he lacks rightful place, the order of the cosmos itself should eventually answer him. That is a comforting idea for any civilization that wants kingship to look stable, ordained, and morally structured. And yet, again, Anzu is not emptied by being politically useful. He remains strange, grand, and not fully reducible to royal propaganda. He's too tied to storm and mountain for that. He retains the feel of something older and rougher than court ideology alone. That is where another possible meaning enters. Anzu may preserve, in transformed form, an ancient awe toward powerful birds of prey and sky force more broadly. Human beings everywhere have looked at eagles and similar creatures with a mix of admiration and unease. They are sovereign-looking animals. They move through a space humans cannot occupy naturally. They strike downward with terrifying precision. They perch in inaccessible places. Even now, large raptors command a kind of respect that smaller birds do not. Enlarge that into myth, merge it with storm imagery, place it against mountains, and then link it with divine conflict, and you get a being that feels as though he rose out of long observation before he ever became a literary character. That matters, because not all mythic figures begin as neat allegories. Some begin as accumulated feeling, the storm above the ridge, the eagle riding violent air, the sense that height itself is a form of rule. Over time, those feelings gather theology, politics, narrative, and symbolism around them. Anzu may be one of those figures. He feels too grounded in the sensory world to be entirely abstract. He has claws because real birds have claws. He has storm because real storms terrify. He lives in the heights because real heights place power beyond easy reach. The myth then builds upward from those realities into a being who can challenge heaven. That would make him not only a symbol, but a mythic condensation of many ancient perceptions at once. There is also the possibility that Anzu meant something about the instability hidden inside power itself. This is a slightly darker reading, but one worth considering. The one who steals the Tablet of Destinies is not a weak or ridiculous figure. He is mighty enough to touch the central instrument of order. That suggests the cosmos is not arranged in a way that excludes dangerous greatness. On the contrary, dangerous greatness exists right beside sacred authority. Power attracts challenge, magnitude attracts ambition. The centre does not exist in a vacuum. It exists surrounded by forces that may want it. That is a sobering thought, and perhaps a realistic one. Mesopotamian cultures had no reason to imagine power as innocent. They saw cities rise in splendour and fall in violence. They saw kings present themselves as divinely chosen and still lose everything. They saw order maintained by force and threatened by force. In such a world, a myth where a powerful being reaches for the highest sign of rule is not fantasy in the escapist sense. It is insight exaggerated into divine form. Seen that way, Anzu may have meant that no order, however sacred, is free from challenge simply because it is old. He may also have meant that the sacred and the dangerous are often uncomfortably close. That closeness is one of the most interesting things about Mesopotamian religion more generally. The divine is not always safe. Gods can bless, punish, destroy, favour, neglect, elevate, and strike down. Sacred objects are powerful because they matter, and what matters can be fought over. Hybrid creatures can protect or threaten. The boundary between holy and terrifying is often thin. Anzu belongs right inside that pattern. He is not secular danger. He is danger at the edge of the divine order itself, which is why he cannot be treated as a mere animal, or a mere demon, or a mere weather sign. He is too entangled with heaven's own structure. This may be why later readers, modern myth lovers, and speculative interpreters keep returning to him. He invites projection, because he already contains several layers at once. One reader sees a cautionary tale about rebellion. Another sees an ancient storm symbol. Another sees a political allegory about kingship and legitimacy. Another sees an older memory of sacred bird imagery. Another sees an expression of natural violence threatening civilization. Another sees the eternal drama of the outsider who reaches too high. All of those readings can coexist because Anzu was not built narrowly. Ancient myths are often stronger than modern categories. They let a figure mean several things because life itself means several things at once. For Mesopotamia specifically, Anzu may have been useful because he allowed the culture to think through the relationship between chaos and order without reducing chaos to pure nonsense. That is important. If chaos is only stupidity, then defeating it proves little. But if chaos is strong, ambitious, intelligent, and genuinely dangerous, then defeating it says something substantial about the order that survives. Anzu makes the gods earn their restoration. He makes Ninurta necessary. He makes the return of the Tablet of Destinies meaningful. Without him, the old order looks static. With him, it looks tested. That is a gift enemies often give myths. They make the world reveal its structure by threatening it. And perhaps that is what something more finally points toward. Anzu may have meant not only monster, not only rebel, not only storm, not only usurper, but a necessary troublemaker in the deepest narrative sense. He is the figure who exposes what order depends on. Before he acts, the divine hierarchy may seem permanent simply because nothing has yet shaken it. After he acts, the hierarchy becomes visible in a new way. People now know what its heart is. They know what happens when that heart is stolen. They know what kind of force is required to restore it. The myth learns itself through Anzu's challenge. That makes him something very rare. A villain who teaches the story what it is about. There is no need to soften him to say that. He is still dangerous, still condemned, still properly defeated. But meaning in myth is rarely generated only by the heroic side. It comes from the pressure both sides create. Anzu's theft forces heaven to reveal its dependence on legitimacy. It forces the assembly to reveal its fear. It forces Ninurta to reveal his function as rightful force. It forces the return of the tablet to become more than routine possession. In other words, Anzu gives everyone else their sharpest shape. That may be why he lingers with such unusual power. He is not just in the story. He helps define the story's deepest terms. And perhaps, for ancient listeners resting beneath uncertain skies, he also carried a simpler truth that never loses force. There are some powers in the world that seem almost royal in their natural state. Storms, mountains, great birds, heights, sudden violence from above. Human beings respond to those things with fear and admiration because they feel close to rule, but outside our rule. Anzu gathers all of that into one figure and then asks the boldest question possible with it. What if such a power did not remain outside the centre? What if it came for the centre itself? Mesopotamia answered that question with a story of theft, panic, battle, and restoration. But the fact that it kept the figure of Anzu alive within that answer suggests that the question mattered almost as much as the solution. The storm bird had to be defeated, yes, but he also had to be imagined first. He had to exist strongly enough for the culture to need him. That is often the best clue to a mythic figure's importance. People do not preserve what has no use in thought. They preserve what helps them feel their world more clearly. Anzu did that. He helped Mesopotamia think about illegitimate power, dangerous ambition, mountain otherness, storm violence, the fragility of sacred order, and the relationship between force and right. He helped it dramatize the fear that what is beyond control might reach into the very seat of control. He helped it picture rebellion not as random destruction, but as focused seizure of the thing that makes command real. And because he did all of that at once, he never settles comfortably into just one label. Monster is true, but incomplete. Rebel is true, but incomplete. Stormbird is true, but incomplete. Political symbol is true, but incomplete. Something more is probably the closest honest answer, because ancient myths are often built precisely to resist being flattened. They want their figures to stay alive in the mind, not pinned down like specimens. Anzu remains alive because he still carries that original force of question. He is what happens when height develops ambition, when wildness learns where authority is kept, when the margins refuse to stay decorative and instead strike directly at the centre. Mesopotamia did not remember him merely because he was strange. It remembered him because he gave form to a set of fears and truths that the culture could not afford to ignore. And once a figure does that, once he becomes both story and thought at the same time, he tends to survive long after the original clay tablets, temples and royal claims have passed into ruin. The old cities are gone, the divine assembly is silent to us except in fragments, and yet the image still holds. A great storm bird in the mountains, bold enough to seize destiny itself. Even defeated, that image remains powerful, and in the last quiet stretch of this story, after the battle and after the meaning, it becomes possible to sit with one final thought about why such a creature still circles in memory at all. There is something especially quiet about a story after the danger has passed. Not empty, exactly. Not silent in the absolute sense. More like the feeling after a storm moves off and the world has not gone back to normal yet, but has at least stopped shaking. The air is still different. The ground still remembers what happened above it. A few things may be broken. A few things may look the same but feel changed. And in that kind of stillness, people begin to think. Not about what to do next in an urgent way, because the urgent part is over. Not about who struck whom or which god held which weapon at which moment, because the action has already done its work. They begin to think about what remains. That is where the story of Anzu becomes especially interesting, because what remains is not just a defeated rebel and a restored Tablet of Destinies. What remains is an image, a great bird in the heights, a storm with intention inside it, a creature that came from the margins and put its claws on the centre of order. And even after the old Mesopotamian world answered that image with battle, judgment and restoration, the image itself did not disappear. It stayed. It kept circling in memory. That is worth sitting with. Because memory is selective in a very strange way. Human beings forget enormous amounts of daily life. Whole generations can pass and ordinary details vanish with almost no trace, yet certain images survive with unusual strength. A flood survives, a giant serpent survives, a tower survives, a burning city survives, a bird in the storm survives, and often the things that survive are not only the things that happened, or were said to happen, they are the things that answered a feeling so deep that the culture could not quite let them go. Anzu feels like one of those things. He is not only a plot device from a distant religion, he is the kind of figure that stays because he touched several human nerves at once. Fear of heights, fear of storms, fear of power in the wrong hands, fear that the ordered world is more fragile than it looks, fear that what waits outside the centre has been watching the centre carefully. Those are not small fears, and they are not fully ancient either. They belong to people in different forms across long stretches of time. That is one reason Anzu still feels alive even now, long after the temples and kings that first spoke his name have fallen into archaeology and dust. And when a figure lasts that way, it is often because he is carrying more than one truth at once. On one level, Anzu stays in memory because he is visually unforgettable. A giant storm bird associated with mountains and divine rebellion is not easy to misplace in the mind. Ancient cultures understood the power of strong imagery. They knew that a creature would be remembered more easily if it felt large enough, strange enough, and close enough to recognizable natural force. And Anzu has all of that. He is made from things people already found arresting: birds of prey, thunder, elevation, claws, the feeling of being watched from above, the uneasy respect human beings have always had for things that move through the sky more confidently than we do. Put those pieces together, and the memory becomes durable before the theology has even finished speaking. But it is not only the image, it is also the position he occupies in the story. Anzu does not stay out at the edges like a weather sign people mutter about and move on from. He moves inward. He reaches for authority itself. And there is something in that movement that human minds tend to remember with unusual force. A danger from far away is one kind of story. A danger that reaches the centre is another. The second one feels more personal, even when the centre belongs to gods instead of people. It tells listeners that no wall, no throne, no ritual, no rank is entirely free from challenge. The farther inward a threat moves, the harder it becomes to forget. That may be why figures of overreach survive so strongly in myth. They represent the moment when limits are tested openly. The bird that steals destiny, the king who wants immortality, the hero who goes too far, the city that trusts its walls too much, the man who thinks the sky can be reached by piling stone high enough. These figures remain because they disturb something basic in the human picture of order. We like to think the world is arranged more securely than it often is. We like to believe that the important things are safe where they sit. A story like Anzu's says they may be safe for a time, but that is not the same as untouchable. Perhaps that is one reason such a story would have felt useful before sleep. Not comfortable exactly, but useful in the way old myths sometimes are. They allow a person to look at fear without having to live it directly. They turn unease into shape. They give the unknown a body, a name, a pattern, and then they let the mind watch what happens. In daily life, anxiety is often shapeless. It hovers. It enters the room without explaining itself. It arrives as weather in the chest, pressure in the thoughts, a sense that something important may be less secure than it ought to be. Ancient myths were good at handling that kind of thing because they took the shapelessness and turned it into a story with edges. Anzu becomes the fear that something from outside order might seize the centre of order. Once that fear has a bird's body and a known fate, the mind can do something with it. It can follow it. It can examine it. It can see it answered. That matters more than we sometimes admit. Human beings do not live by facts alone. We live by patterns, and part of why stories endure is that they provide patterns for feelings too old to explain in ordinary language. A storm bird stealing the Tablet of Destinies is not a news report. It is a pattern for a certain kind of fear, and because that fear never fully disappears from human life, the story keeps its weight. There is also the matter of what the sky means to us even now. We are not, most of us, ancient Mesopotamians listening for omens in a world built from mud brick, barley, temple offerings and river uncertainty. But the sky still does something to the mind. It remains the one space everyone sees and no one governs. Planes cross it, satellites pass through it, storms develop in it, birds vanish into it. Yet for all our instruments and forecasts, there is still something about the upper air that feels beyond ownership. The ground can be divided, buildings can be controlled, even seas are charted. The sky remains, in a deep emotional sense, slightly untamed. That old feeling is probably part of why a creature like Anzu does not go completely dead in memory. He belongs to a domain that has never become entirely ordinary. A bird on the ground is one thing. A bird in stormlight above mountains is another. Height changes meaning. It adds distance, rule, and unease all at once. Human beings have always looked upward and felt something larger than themselves there. Sometimes that feeling becomes religion, sometimes science, sometimes weather anxiety, sometimes myth. Sometimes just a long look through a window at night when the clouds are moving quickly and nothing feels fully settled. Anzu belongs to that upward feeling. And perhaps he also stays because he gives shape to a very specific human suspicion, one that never quite leaves, that the things we rely on most may be more vulnerable than they appear. In the myth, the gods themselves rely on order, rank, custody, and rightful possession. The Tablet of Destinies belongs where it belongs until suddenly it does not. That is a frightening moment because it exposes the structure beneath confidence. Many things in life feel permanent until the day they are tested. Institutions, families, reputations, cities, habits, assumptions about tomorrow, none of them usually announce their fragility in advance. They simply appear stable until one event reveals where the strain was always possible. Anzu is one of those revealing events made into a creature. That may be why he is more than just entertaining. He is uncomfortable in a lasting way. He reminds the listener that order is often strongest when it is being maintained, not when it is being taken for granted. And though the story resolves with restoration, it does not fully take back the revelation. The gods win, yes. The tablet returns, yes. The centre holds again, yes. But now everyone knows that the centre can be reached. That knowledge lingers in the background, and perhaps that is part of what keeps Anzu circling in memory even after his defeat. He has become the name of a lesson no order likes learning. Still, there is something almost reassuring in the fact that memory kept both parts of the story. It kept the theft, but it also kept the restoration. It kept the storm bird, but it also kept the warrior who answered him. It kept panic, and it kept response. That is important. A culture could have remembered only the fear, but instead it preserved the pattern in full. Something dangerous rises, something rightful answers. The world is shaken, the world is repaired. That is not a guarantee that everything always ends well. Ancient people knew better than that, but it is a statement that disruption does not have to be final to be real, and restoration does not have to be easy to matter. That balance may be exactly why the story works as a quiet thought before sleep. It does not lie. It does not say there are no storm birds. It does not say the centre cannot be reached. It does not say power is always safe in proper hands. Instead it says something more sober. The world includes rebellion, theft, wild force, and dangerous ambition. It also includes answer, recovery, and the effort required to put important things back where they belong. That is not innocence, it is steadiness. And steadiness is often better company at night than innocence ever was. There is another possibility too. Perhaps Anzu stays in human memory, because some part of us recognises him a little too well. Not as a literal bird, of course, but as a pattern inside human life. The reach beyond one's proper limits, the desire to hold what gives power rather than merely serve under it. The temptation to think possession itself makes something rightful. Those are not only divine or mythic problems, they are human problems. People do this in small ways and large ones. They take what was not meant for them and tell themselves that holding it proves they deserve it. They confuse access with legitimacy. They mistake boldness for right. They believe that if they can touch the centre, they can become the centre. That is Anzu-like thinking in a sense. Perhaps that is too severe a way to put it before bed, but old myths are sometimes severe in useful ways. They remind people that power and worth are not automatically the same thing. They remind people that being able to see something is not the same as being meant to hold it. They remind people that certain kinds of ambition carry a storm inside them. That may be one reason the figure of the usurper remains so compelling across cultures. He's not only someone out there, he's also a possibility in here, in the private part of the mind that wants more than it has been given, and occasionally tells itself that wanting is enough to justify taking. Anzu gives that possibility feathers and weather. At the same time, it would be too simple to reduce him to a moral lesson and tuck him away neatly. He remains larger than that. He's not just greed with wings. He's also the memory of the wild itself refusing to stay outside the city's self-understanding. This matters because there is always something slightly artificial in the way human beings talk themselves into thinking their systems are the whole world. A city can begin to believe that its walls define reality. A kingdom can begin to believe that its records and boundaries settle what exists. A modern society can begin to believe that control is normal and uncertainty is an error. Then weather arrives. Then landscape reminds everyone it was here first. Then some force from outside the comfortable map presses inward, and everyone remembers that order was always partly negotiated, never absolute. Anzu may carry that reminder too. He comes from the heights, from the places not fully integrated into lowland order, from where storm and distance still rule themselves. When he steals the Tablet of Destinies, it is almost as though the world beyond administration briefly grabs administration by the throat and says, "Do not mistake your managed centre for the whole of power." That is a rude message, but myths do not always deal in politeness. Sometimes they deal in exposure, and if Anzu exposes the limits of control, then perhaps that also explains why he remains meaningful in later memory. Human beings never stop needing reminders that the world is bigger, rougher, and less obedient than our institutions prefer, and yet the story does not glorify him for that. It does not decide that because he exposed a truth he should keep the tablet. That is an important difference. Myth can acknowledge a truth in the rebel without granting the rebel the throne. Anzu reveals vulnerability, but he is still wrong to seize destiny. He reveals the power of the margins, but he is still wrong to place that power at the centre by theft. This too feels human and enduring. Some challenges speak truth about a system's weakness, without becoming rightful alternatives themselves. The fact that they expose something real does not mean they should rule what they exposed. Ancient myth, at its best, can hold both ideas at once. That is part of why Anzu remains so rich as a figure. He is not flattened by being defeated. Defeat removes the danger, but leaves the meaning behind. And perhaps that is what memory does with all its strongest images. It removes the emergency and keeps the shape. Over time, the exact details of ancient ritual context may fade for most people. The names of gods may grow unfamiliar. The original language may be lost to everyone but specialists. But the shape remains. A storm bird steals destiny. Heaven panics. A warrior rises. The bird falls. Order returns. Then the image keeps moving in the mind long after the event is over. That is how deep stories survive. They become simpler without becoming small. They become portable without becoming empty. Anzu has done that. He has travelled a very long way from the old clay tablets. He now lives not only in scholarly books or careful translations, but in the broader human fascination with creatures that challenge the sky, the throne, the lawful centre, the idea that order is permanent. He lives anywhere. People still tell stories about ambition that rises too high, about the fear of power seized without right, about the old suspicion that some things over our heads are carrying more intention than we would like. He lives in the image of wings against dark cloud. He lives in the uneasy respect people still feel for heights and storms. He lives in the recurring thought that what is outside the circle may someday test the circle directly. That is a lot for one mythic bird to carry, but then mythic birds are rarely small-minded creatures. There is also something almost tender in the fact that human memory holds on to what frightened it, provided the frightening thing was given form and answer. We do not only remember victories, We remember what needed defeating. We remember the shape of the fear. We remember the weather around it. Perhaps that is one of the quieter functions of old stories. They let us keep company with danger after the danger has passed, not because we enjoy fear for its own sake, but because some part of us wants to make sure we understand what kind of world we're living in. And the world, whether ancient Mesopotamian or modern in a completely different way, is still one where order has to be maintained, and where certain forces always seem to gather at the edges. Not always birds, not always storms, sometimes pressures, ideas, disasters, failures, ambitions, or the simple fact that what feels secure can shift. The old story does not solve that forever. It simply gives the mind a way to think it through. If the storm bird still circles in human memory, perhaps it is because the conditions that first gave him life have not disappeared. We still know what it is to look at something above us and feel small. We still know what it is to worry that the structure of things may not be as firm as it looked yesterday. We still know what it is to watch powerful people confuse possession with right. We still know what it is to need some answer, some Ninurta-like force of correction, when the centre has been touched by the wrong hands. The names change. The settings change. The mountains may become other kinds of distance. The tablet may become other kinds of authority. But the pattern remains close enough to recognize. That is probably why Anzu does not sleep completely. He circles because the thought he carries keeps returning. Not every night, perhaps. Not loudly. But from time to time, when the world feels slightly unstable, when the sky outside has that heavy look of weather gathering somewhere beyond the window, when the mind turns toward old questions about power, order, and how much is really being held together beneath ordinary life, the image comes back. A great bird in the heights, a dangerous reach toward the centre, a reminder that what matters most can be threatened, and that the answer, if it comes, must be willing to climb into the storm and bring it back. There is something steadying in that too, not because it makes the world simple, but because it says the old fears were seen clearly a very long time ago. People before us knew these feelings in their own language. They gave them clay, story, and wings. They let the storm bird rise. They let him steal destiny. They let the heavens shake. And then they let the world be restored without pretending the memory of the shaking had vanished. That is a very honest kind of comfort. The world may be uncertain, but uncertainty is not new. The sky may feel larger than us, but it always did. The important things may sometimes slip into danger, but human beings have been telling stories for thousands of years about going after them and bringing them home. So as the night grows quieter and the old storm bird drifts a little farther into that distant place, where myths wait when we are not actively thinking about them, it may be enough simply to leave him there in the high dark of memory, not fully gone, not pressing too close, just circling at the edge of thought where ancient fear becomes old wisdom, and the sky remains wide above the sleeping world.